Who do you think you are to leave a balloon on my son's grave? And she freezes at the response. Helen Wilson felt her blood boil when she saw that familiar figure approaching the grave with colorful balloons in hand. It was the fourth week in a row that this had happened, and this time she had arrived earlier on purpose to catch who had the audacity to interfere with her grief. The young woman with brown hair didn't notice Helen's presence until she was very close to the headstone. She was holding a baby just a few months old in her arms while tying the balloons with her free hand. That's when Helen approached with firm steps, her voice filled with contained anger. "Who do you think you are to leave a balloon on my son's grave?" The young woman turned around startled, almost dropping the balloons. The baby began to whimper at the sudden movement. I can explain." The young woman tried to speak, but Helen wasn't interested in listening. "Explain what?" "That you keep coming here every week to put on this show?" Helen gestured with her hands, her dark coat swaying with her nervous movements. "Did you know my son? Were you his girlfriend? Because if you're one of those girls who chased after him for the family's money—" "No, ma'am, you don't understand." The young woman held the baby more tightly, trying to position herself between him and the furious woman. "Please, let me explain." "Then explain right now." Helen crossed her arms, her jaw tense. "And make it quick, because I'm already losing my patience. Do you have any idea how much I suffer coming here? And you turn it into a spectacle with colorful balloons, as if it were a children's party." The words came out with such force that some visitors at nearby graves looked in their direction. The young woman lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly. "My name is Megan, and I didn't know your son as a girlfriend or anything like that. I met him at the hospital." Helen's eyes widened, but her expression didn't soften. "Hospital? Which hospital?" "St. Luke's Hospital, 2 years ago." Megan adjusted the baby in her lap, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Do you know what severe anemia is? I had it. I was 3 months pregnant when I found out my condition was so serious I might not survive childbirth." Something in the young woman's voice made Helen relax her posture minimally, but she still kept suspicion written on her face. "And what does my son have to do with that?" "He saved our lives." Megan looked at the baby in her arms, then back at Helen. "My son's. And mine. Without him, neither of us would be here today." Helen felt her legs tremble. She looked for the stone bench near the grave and sat down, without taking her eyes off the young woman. "What do you mean, saved? Richard never told me anything about—" "Richard was his name?" Megan asked softly, and for the first time there was an expression of genuine surprise on her face. "He never told me his full name. Always asked me to just call him Rich." The nickname hit Helen like a punch in the stomach. That's how her son asked his closest friends to call him, a detail she had never made public after his passing. "Sit here." Helen tapped the bench beside her, her voice losing some of its harshness. "Tell me everything from the beginning. But no lies, because I'll know if you're making things up." Megan approached slowly, like someone afraid of scaring a wounded animal. She sat down, keeping some distance, the baby now calmer in her lap. 2 years ago, I was admitted to St. Luke's because I was bleeding during pregnancy. The doctors found out my anemia was much worse than they thought, and that I would need constant transfusions if I wanted to keep the baby. Megan paused, her eyes becoming moist. "My blood type is rare, AB negative, E. And the blood bank was running low." Helen remained silent, but her whole body was tense, waiting for the rest of the story. "That's when I met Rich. He was at the hospital for some routine tests, at least that's what he said. We started talking in the waiting room because he noticed I was crying." Megan smiled sadly at the memory. "He had such a gentle way of making people feel better, you know, even when the situation was terrible." "That was my son." Helen agreed, almost without realizing it, her voice soft. "He was always like that ever since he was little. When he found out about my situation, he asked what my blood type was. When I told him, he got quiet for a while. Then he asked me to wait a bit and left. He came back half an hour later saying he had talked to the doctors and that he could donate blood for me." "He had AB negative too," Helen murmured, the pieces starting to fall into place in her mind. He inherited it from his father. I didn't want to accept it at first. It was too much generosity from a stranger. But he insisted, said it cost him nothing and that it could make all the difference for me and the baby. Megan wiped away a tear that had fallen. In the following months, he donated blood for me 3 times. He always showed up at the hospital with that smile, asking how I was, how the baby was growing. Helen felt her chest tighten with every word. How did she not know any of this? Why had Richard never told her? The last time I saw Rich was 2 weeks before he passed. Megan avoided using the word, respecting the moment. He had helped me so much that I wanted to do something for him. I asked if he wanted to be the baby's godfather when he was born. He was so happy, said it would be an honor. And why did he never tell me? Helen finally managed to articulate the question pounding in her mind. Why would my son hide something like this from me? Megan hesitated, biting her lower lip before answering. Because he was hiding something else from you too, and I think he was afraid that if he told you about me, you would find out the rest. What rest? Helen turned completely to the young woman, her heart racing. What are you talking about? Rich wasn't at the hospital just for routine tests. Megan held Helen's gaze, though with difficulty. He was in treatment. For his heart. The world seemed to stop around Helen. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Heart treatment? Richard? I didn't know at first either. Megan continued quickly. It was only after the second donation that he told me. He said he had a heart condition that he discovered a few years ago, but that it was controlled with medication. The doctors warned him that donating blood might not be the best idea considering his condition, but he didn't care. This can't be true, Helen shook her head, refusing to believe. He would have told me. I was his mother, for God's sake. He wanted to tell you, Mrs. Helen. Megan used the name she had heard during their initial confrontation. He talked about it with me. He said he had tried several times, but always thought it wasn't the right time. That you had already suffered so much with the loss of your husband, and that he didn't want to add more worry. Helen stood up abruptly from the bench, starting to pace in circles. The information was too much, too fast. Her son had a heart condition. He was donating blood for a stranger despite the risks, all happening without her knowing anything. Show me proof. Helen stopped walking and stared at Megan. If all this is true, you must have something that proves it. Megan adjusted the baby in her lap and began searching for something in the bag hanging from her shoulder. After a few seconds, she pulled out her phone. I have the messages. She unlocked the device and started scrolling through the screen. We used to text a lot between hospital visits. Helen approached, looking over Megan's shoulder as the young woman showed the conversations. And there it was, the number she recognized, Richard's way of writing, the inside jokes he always made. Everything authentic, impossible to fake. One message in particular caught her attention. Megan, do you think I should tell my mum about my heart? I'm afraid of her reaction. She's already lost so much. Megan's reply, I think so, Rich. Mothers are stronger than we imagine, and she has the right to know, to be able to take care of you too. Maybe you're right. I'll try to talk to her this weekend. Helen felt the tears begin to fall. That weekend. She remembered perfectly. Richard had come home on Friday night looking anxious. He said he needed to talk to her about something important on Saturday morning. But she had woken up in a bad mood, stressed about problems with the company she was still managing at the time. When Richard tried to start a conversation, she said she was tired and they could talk later. Later never happened. The following Monday, they found Richard in his room. His heart had stopped during his sleep. I should have listened, Helen whispered, her hands trembling. He tried to tell me and I said I was tired. Megan stayed silent, giving space for the weight of that revelation to settle. The baby began to move, making little sounds. You couldn't have known, Megan finally said. And he wouldn't blame you for it. In the conversations we had, he always spoke of you with so much love, so much pride. He said he wanted to be strong like you, that you had survived so much. But I didn't survive. Helen wiped her tears with the back of her hand. I'm just here, breathing. It's not the same as living. The baby began to whimper more loudly, and Megan started to rock him gently. Can I show you something? Megan asked hesitantly. Something that might help you understand better. Helen nodded, still processing everything she had discovered in the last few minutes. Megan adjusted the baby so Helen could see his face better. The little one had stopped crying and was looking around curiously, his light-colored eyes catching the sunlight filtered through the cemetery trees. This is Gabriel, Megan said with tenderness in her voice. I named him after Rich. Gabriel Richard. Helen felt her chest tighten again, but this time it was different. There was something comforting in knowing that her son was being remembered, honored through this child who only existed because of him. May I hold him? The words came out before Helen could think better of it. Megan hesitated only a second before extending the baby toward Helen. The older woman received Gabriel carefully, as if holding something extremely precious and fragile. And perhaps she was. This was the living legacy of her son, the proof that he had made a difference in the world in a way she had never imagined. Gabriel looked at Helen with those big, curious eyes. Then, to the surprise of both women, the baby smiled. A wide, toothless smile that lit up his whole little face. He doesn't usually smile like that for strangers, Megan commented softly. It usually takes him a while to get used to new people. Helen couldn't take her eyes off the baby. There was something in the way Gabriel looked at her, something familiar and comforting. Do you come here every week? Helen asked, still holding Gabriel. Every Tuesday, Megan confirmed. It's the day Rich made the donations. I thought it would be a good way to say thank you, to keep his memory alive. The balloons were because, well, he always said life was meant to be celebrated, not mourned. Helen looked at the colorful balloons Megan had brought. Blue, yellow, purple, vibrant and cheerful colors that contrasted with the somber atmosphere of the cemetery. Richard would truly say something like that. He was always the most optimistic person she knew, even in the toughest moments. I'm sorry, Helen finally said, handing Gabriel back to Megan carefully. For yelling at you, for judging without knowing the story, it's been so hard dealing with all of this. I understand. Megan accepted the baby back, a small, sad smile on her face. I can't imagine the pain of losing a son, but I want you to know that Rich was one of the most incredible people I've ever met. And I'll make sure Gabriel grows up knowing about the man who saved his life even before he was born. The two women stood in silence for a few moments, each absorbing the intensity of that morning at the cemetery. Helen looked at Richard's grave, where the letters of his full name were engraved in cold stone. Richard Henry Wilson, beloved son. Those words she had chosen so carefully seemed insufficient now. They didn't capture even a fraction of who he really was. Would you like to get some coffee? Helen heard herself asking, surprised by her own words. Maybe we could talk more. About Richard. About everything. Megan seemed equally surprised by the invitation, but after a brief hesitation, she agreed with a nod. I'd love to. There's a coffee shop a few blocks from here. They serve a very good cappuccino. The two began walking together toward the cemetery exit, the colorful balloons now tied to Richard's grave, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Helen looked back one last time, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel only pain when seeing that place. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The coffee shop was small and cozy, with wooden tables and a strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Helen chose a table in the corner, a bit away from the others, where they could talk with more privacy. Megan sat facing her, adjusting Gabriel in the baby carrier she had brought in her bag. So, Helen began after the waiter took their orders, tell me more about how you met Richard. You said it was in the waiting room. Megan nodded, fiddling with the napkin on the table. It was a day I was particularly scared. The doctors had just told me my anemia was getting worse and that they might need to do a more serious intervention. I was alone. My husband had stayed at work. She paused, and Helen noticed a shadow crossing her face when she mentioned her husband. Rich sat next to me and simply asked if I was okay. Most people avoid doing that, you know. They prefer to pretend they don't see when someone is unwell. He was always like that, Helen said, a hint of pride coloring her voice. Since he was a child, he couldn't see anyone sad without trying to help. I remember one time, he was about 8 years old, he found an injured dog on the street. He brought it home, took care of it for weeks until he could find a family willing to adopt it. Megan smiled at the story. That sounds exactly like him. We talked for almost an hour that first day. He told me about the family business, about how he was trying to convince you to retire so you could rest more. Megan looked at Helen with curiosity. He worried a lot about you. And I didn't notice, Helen whispered, more to herself than to Megan. I was so focused on keeping the company running, on proving I could move forward after my husband passed away, that I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. The waiter arrived with the coffees, momentarily interrupting the conversation. Helen stirred the sugar in her cappuccino automatically, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. When did Richard find out about his heart condition? Helen finally asked, needing to understand the timeline of everything she had missed. He told me it was about 5 years ago, Megan replied carefully. It started with some strange palpitations. At first, he thought it was work stress, but then he started having more severe episodes. That's when he decided to see a doctor. 5 years. Helen tried to remember that time. Richard was 23. She was starting to delegate more responsibilities to him at the company, thinking it was time to prepare him to eventually take over everything. She had noticed he seemed tired sometimes, but she attributed it to the workload. What did the doctors say? Helen pressed, needing to know every detail she had missed. That it was a genetic arrhythmia, Megan explained. It could be controlled with medication and lifestyle changes. The prognosis was good, as long as he took care of his health and had regular checkups. And yet he decided to donate blood for you, Helen stated, not asked. Knowing the risks. The doctors didn't recommend it, Megan admitted softly. But he insisted. He said some things are worth the risk, that if he didn't do anything, he couldn't live with himself. Helen took a long sip of her coffee, trying to process the mix of pride and frustration she felt. Pride for the generous man her son had become, frustration for not having had the chance to fully know this side of him. Tell me more about the moments you spent together, Helen requested, realizing she needed these stories, these small windows into the life of the son she hadn't fully known. The conversations, the moments, everything. Megan smiled, and for a moment she seemed much younger, almost like a teenager. We talked about everything. He told me about his plans for the future, about wanting to travel more, to see the world. He said he had spent so much time focused on the company that he forgot to live a little. This revelation cut deep into Helen. Was it her fault? Had she put so much pressure on Richard to continue the family legacy that he felt trapped? But he didn't say it with resentment, Megan quickly added, as if sensing the shift in the air. On the contrary, he loved working at the company. He loved making you proud. He just wanted to find a balance, you know. And I never asked, Helen murmured. I never stopped to ask if he was happy, if he was okay. I just assumed everything was fine because he never complained. Gabriel started to stir in his car seat, making little noises. Megan took the bottle from her bag, testing the temperature of the milk before offering it to the baby. Rich also told me about his father, Megan said while feeding Gabriel, about how hard it was for the family when he passed. Helen nodded, her throat tightening with the memory. Charles passed away 7 years ago. A sudden heart attack right in the office. It was completely unexpected. She paused, looking into the distance. Richard was 19. He was the one who got the call from the hospital, who had to give me the news. He said he promised his father, in his final moments, that he would take care of you and the company, Megan revealed gently. That he wouldn't let his father's legacy be lost. Tears welled up in Helen's eyes again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. 19 years old. He was practically a child. And I let him carry all that weight. Helen shook her head. What kind of mother was I? A mother who was dealing with her own grief, Megan said firmly. Rich never blamed you for anything. Never. He understood perfectly why you threw yourself into work, why you needed to keep your mind occupied. He did the same thing. But I was the adult, the mother, Helen insisted. I should have been stronger, should have realized that he was also suffering, also needed support. Blaming yourself won't change the past, Megan said, her voice gentle but firm, but it can change what you do now. Helen looked at the young woman with curiosity. What do you mean? Rich told me a lot about your life, Mrs. Helen, about the dreams he had, the things he wanted to do. Maybe it's time for you to live some of those things for him, to honor his memory not just by visiting a grave, but by doing the things he would have wanted to do. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. Helen had spent the last 2 years in a kind of limbo, keeping up appearances, running the business on autopilot, but without really living, just existing from one day to the next. I don't know if I can, Helen admitted. It's been so long since I really lived that I don't even know how anymore. Small steps, Megan encouraged. That's how I managed to move forward after almost losing Gabriel during the pregnancy. One day at a time, one small choice at a time. Gabriel had finished his bottle and was now looking around curiously, his little eyes bright and alert. Helen found herself smiling at the baby, a strange but welcome feeling after feeling numb for so long. You said your husband was at work when you got the bad news from the doctors. Helen changed the subject, noticing that Megan had become tense when mentioning her husband earlier. Did he support you through the whole process? Megan looked down, focusing on the coffee cup in front of her. Ryan, my husband, is complicated. She chose her words carefully. He was happy about the pregnancy at first, but when the problem started, he kind of pulled away, said he couldn't handle the possibility of losing the baby. And he left you to deal with it alone? Helen couldn't hide the disapproval in her voice. He showed up sometimes, Megan defended weakly. But yes, I spent a lot of time alone at the hospital. That's when Rich became my biggest support. He was there at every donation, would talk with me afterward, made sure I was okay before leaving. Helen felt a wave of gratitude mixed with sadness. Ryan had been for Megan what she wished she had been for him, a constant support, a comforting presence in the most difficult times. Does your husband know you come to the cemetery every week? Helen asked, sensing there was more to the story. Megan hesitated before answering, confirming Helen's suspicions. He knows and he doesn't like it, she finally admitted. He thinks it's an unhealthy obsession, that I should forget and move on. But how can I forget the person who saved my son's life? You can't, and you shouldn't have to, Helen said with conviction. What Ryan did deserves to be remembered, celebrated. There's nothing unhealthy about gratitude. Megan looked at Helen with eyes full of held-back tears. Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I wonder if Ryan is right, if I'm being too dramatic. You're not. Helen reached for Megan's hand across the table, squeezing it gently. And if your husband can't understand the importance of this, then the problem is with him, not with you. The two women fell silent for a moment, a tacit connection forming between them. Two strangers who shared the legacy of a good man, united by gratitude and loss. Can I ask you a question? Helen said after a moment. And you can be honest with me. Of course. Megan agreed. Do you think donating blood for you contributed for his heart to stop? The question was hard to ask, but Helen needed to know. Megan closed her eyes for a moment, clearly wrestling with the same question that had probably haunted her for a long time. The doctors told me no. She opened her eyes, meeting Helen's gaze. That his condition was unpredictable and it could have happened at any time. But I can't stop wondering, you know? If I hadn't accepted his help, if I had found another solution— No, Helen interrupted firmly. You will not carry that guilt. Richard made a conscious choice. He knew the risks and chose to help anyway. That was his decision, and I know my son well enough to know he would never regret it. How can you be so sure? Because in the end, he managed to do exactly what he always wanted, to make a meaningful difference in someone's life, to save 2 lives. Helen smiled through her tears. He would have done it again without hesitation, even knowing the outcome. Megan nodded, wiping her own tears. You're right. He used to say the worst thing a person can do is live in fear of actually living. Wise for someone so young, Helen commented, feeling a pang of pride mixed with sadness. He learned from you, Megan said. He always talked about how brave you were, how you faced the loss of your husband and kept running the company, raising him alone. He admired you so much. Helen didn't know what to say. She had spent so much time feeling like a failure as a mother over the past 2 years that hearing Richard admired her was almost impossible to process. I would like to, Helen began hesitantly. I would like to keep talking with you, to learn more about Gabriel. If you're comfortable with that, of course. Megan smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole face. I would love that. Gabriel needs to hear stories about Rich from someone who knew him his whole life. And I would really like to have someone who understands what he meant. Your husband is still... Helen left the question hanging, not wanting to be intrusive, but clearly curious. Being difficult about all this? Yes. Megan sighed. But it's something I'll have to work out. Gabriel deserves to grow up knowing the truth about who saved him, and I won't let anyone erase Rich's memory from our lives, not even my own husband. Helen found herself admiring that young woman's strength. At just 20-something, carrying a baby, dealing with a husband who clearly didn't support her, and yet standing firm in her gratitude and respect. You're much stronger than you think, Helen said, and I'm sure that's exactly why Richard wanted to help you. He was always good at recognizing good people. The two kept talking for another hour, exchanging stories about Richard, sharing memories they didn't even know they were missing until they found each other. Gabriel slept peacefully through most of the conversation, occasionally stirring or making baby noises that made both women smile. When they finally said goodbye on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, with promises to meet again next week, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the hope that things would go back to how they were, because she knew that was impossible. But hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still purpose and meaning waiting for her, and that Richard's legacy was much bigger than she had ever imagined. As she drove back home, Helen couldn't stop thinking about everything she had discovered. The son she thought she knew completely had a whole secret life, not in a malicious or deceitful way, but because he was trying to protect her, trying to spare her from more worries after everything she had already been through. When she arrived home, the large mansion in the Upper East Side neighborhood seemed even emptier than usual. Helen went up the stairs to Richard's room, something she hadn't done in months. It had been too painful to go in there, to see his things exactly as he had left them. But now, with everything Megan had revealed, she needed to search. She needed to find something, anything that could give more clues about this part of her son's life that she didn't know. The room was exactly as she remembered. The bed still made, the desk organized, the shelves full of books and some trophies from teenage sports competitions. Helen started with the desk, opening the drawers one by one. In the third drawer, she found a notebook. It wasn't exactly a diary, more like a notebook of various notes. There were sketches, to-do lists, phone numbers, and there, between the middle pages, she found what she was looking for. An entire section dedicated to Megan. There were notes about the dates of the donations, information about her pregnancy, concerns about her health and the babies. Richard had followed everything closely, much more than Megan probably knew. On a specific page, she found a list of baby names. Next to each name, Richard had written meanings and observations. One name was circled with emphasis: Gabriel. Warrior of God was written next to it, with an additional note: perfect name for a little warrior who's fighting to live even before being born. Helen held the notebook to her chest, tears flowing freely now. Richard hadn't just donated blood. He had cared deeply, had invested emotionally in that young mother's life and her baby, perhaps even more than Megan knew. She continued flipping through the notebook and found more things. Plans for the future that Richard had, including one that made her stop. Talk to Mum about everything. She deserves to know. I need to stop trying to protect her from everything. The date written next to it was 3 days before he passed away. He was planning to tell her. He was finally ready to share everything with her, and she, too busy, too stressed, had said she was tired and that they would talk later. Helen closed the notebook and looked around the room. How many other things didn't she know? How many other parts of her son's life had she missed by being so focused on just surviving day after day? She picked up the phone and, before she could think better of it, typed a message to Megan, whose number she had requested at the coffee shop. "Megan, I found some things here that I think you'd like to see. Whenever you can, come visit me. And bring Gabriel. This house has been empty for too long." The reply came a few minutes later. "I'd love to. How about Thursday afternoon?" "Perfect. I'll send you the address." Helen put the notebook away and went down the stairs. For the first time in 2 years, she began to really look at the house. Every room was impeccable, maintained by a cleaning crew that came 3 times a week. But there was no life. There was no warmth. Only beautiful furniture and empty spaces echoing with memories of the past. Maybe it was time to change that. She didn't know yet how or exactly what she would do, but there was a seed of something being planted in her chest. An idea, still hazy, but that was beginning to take shape. Thursday arrived faster than Helen expected. She spent the days between Tuesday and Thursday in a mix of anxiety and anticipation. She had tidied the house herself, ignoring the housekeeper's protests that she didn't need to do that. But Helen needed to. She needed to do something with her own hands, needed to create a welcoming environment. When the doorbell rang at 3 in the afternoon, Helen almost ran to the door. Megan was there with Gabriel in her arms and a huge bag hanging from her shoulder, the way all mothers of babies seem to carry the whole world with them wherever they go. Come in, Helen said, opening the door completely. "Wow, that bag looks heavy. Let me help you." "Thank you." Megan entered, her eyes widening as she saw the interior of the house. "Wow, what a beautiful place." "It's too big for one person," Helen commented as she guided Megan to the living room. "But it was the dream of Charles, my late husband. He grew up in a small house and always wanted to have a big house to raise a family." The living room was spacious, with comfortable beige sofas, a large window that looked out onto the garden, and several family photos decorating the walls and shelves. Megan approached a particular photo, one of Richard as a teenager, smiling broadly with a swimming trophy in his hands. "He used to swim?" Megan asked. "Throughout his teenage years," Helen confirmed, picking up the photo to look at it more closely. "He was very good. He won several state competitions. He stopped when he started college, said he needed to focus on his studies and the company." "He never mentioned it," Megan said softly. "But it makes sense. He had broad shoulders, a swimmer's posture." Helen put the photo back and turned to Megan. "I brought that notebook I told you about. I think you'll want to see some things in it." The two sat on the sofa, Gabriel positioned between them in his car seat. Helen opened the notebook to the page with notes about Megan and the pregnancy. The young mother read in silence, her eyes growing increasingly moist as she processed the level of care and attention that Richard had dedicated to her. "I didn't know he cared so much," Megan murmured. "I mean, he always asked how I was, but this—" She gestured to the detailed notes. "This is much more than just casual concern." "My son had a huge heart," Helen said, with a mix of pride and sadness. "When he cared about someone, he cared for real, intensely, completely." Megan continued flipping through the notebook, stopping at the page of baby names. "He suggested the name Gabriel?" She looked at Helen in surprise. "I thought it was a coincidence that the name I chose was similar to his." "It seems it wasn't a coincidence," Helen pointed to the notes. "He clearly thought a lot about it." "Warrior of God," Megan read aloud, touching the words with reverence. "That's exactly what Gabriel is, a little warrior who fought to live even before he was born." The two were silent for a moment, absorbed in the revelations from the notebook. Gabriel began to stir, making little noises that indicated he was about to wake from his nap. "May I hold him?" Helen asked when the baby's eyes opened. "Of course," Megan smiled. "I think he already likes you." Helen carefully picked up Gabriel, and the baby looked at her with those big, curious eyes. Then, to the surprise of both, he reached out his little hand and gripped Helen's finger tightly. Look at that, Megan laughed. He really likes you. Hi, Gabriel. Helen spoke softly to the baby. Do you know you owe your name to a very special man? One day, when you're big enough to understand, I'll tell you all about him. Megan wiped away a tear that escaped, moved by the scene. It was beautiful to see that woman, who 2 days ago was so full of anger and pain, now holding her son with such tenderness. You know, Megan began hesitantly, I always imagined that when Gabriel was big enough, I would bring him here, to meet you, to hear stories about Rich. But I was afraid that you wouldn't want to see me, that you wouldn't want this constant reminder of the loss. You are not a reminder of the loss, Helen said firmly, still holding Gabriel. You and Gabriel are proof that my son's life had meaning, had impact. This is a gift, not a loss. The words seemed to touch Megan deeply. She had carried so much fear and uncertainty about how Richard's mother would react when she found out everything. And now, discovering that she was not only welcome but valued was almost too much to process. My husband doesn't understand, Megan suddenly confessed, the words pouring out in a torrent. He thinks I'm obsessive, that I'm giving too much importance to someone he sees as just a blood donor. But he doesn't understand what that moment was like, the desperation I felt thinking I would lose my baby. And then Rich appeared like an angel, offering to save my life and my son's life without asking for anything in return. Helen listened in silence, allowing Megan to vent. Things have been difficult at home, Megan continued. Ryan, my husband, is growing more distant. He complains when I mention Rich, gets irritated when I say I'm going to the cemetery. He even suggested that I'm using Gabriel as an excuse to maintain an obsession with a dead man, as if there was something romantic in my gratitude. It's absurd and painful. Sounds like jealousy, Helen observed. But jealousy of what? Megan seemed genuinely confused. Rich was a friend, a savior. There was never anything beyond friendship and gratitude. Sometimes people get jealous not of a romantic relationship, but of the emotional importance someone had in their partner's life, Helen explained. Your husband probably feels he failed to be there for you when you needed him most, and Richard filled that void. It makes him feel inadequate, so instead of dealing with his own feelings, he attacks your gratitude. Megan processed the words, recognizing the truth in them. He should have been there, she said softly. I was going through the scariest moment of my life, and he chose to stay at work, avoid the hospital, act as if ignoring the problem would make it disappear. And you deserved better, Helen said bluntly. You deserve better now too. Gabriel began to whimper, and Megan checked the clock. It's time for his bottle. Do you mind if I... Of course not. Let me show you the kitchen. I can warm the milk for you. The two went to the spacious kitchen, fully equipped with modern appliances that were rarely used. Helen warmed the milk, while Megan prepared the bottle, the two falling into a comfortable rhythm of cooperation. Have you thought about having more children? Helen asked as she handed the warmed milk to Megan. I don't know if I'll have the opportunity, Megan replied honestly. The way things are with Ryan, I'm not sure how much longer we'll be together. Are you thinking about separating? I've been thinking about a lot of things lately, Megan admitted. But I'm also scared. Scared of trying to raise Gabriel alone. Scared I won't be able to support myself financially. I dropped out of college when I got pregnant and haven't gone back. Ryan supports us, and he's made it very clear that if I leave, he'll make things difficult for me. Helen felt a wave of anger on behalf of the young woman. What kind of man threatens the mother of his own child in that way? You're not alone, Helen said impulsively. If you need help, any kind of help, I'm here. Megan looked at Helen with wide eyes. You barely know me. I know enough, Helen insisted. I know you're a brave young mother who's been through terrible things and still finds time to honor the memory of someone who helped her. I know my son saw something special in you, and his judgment was always impeccable, and I know you're exactly the kind of person who deserves to have someone in your corner. Megan couldn't hold back the tears this time. She set the bottle aside and hugged Helen, a tight, desperate embrace from someone who had carried the weight of the world alone for far too long. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea how much this means to me." Helen returned the hug, surprised by how comforting it was to have someone to support, someone to care for. Over the past 2 years, she had isolated herself so much that she forgot how good it felt to connect with another person, to make a difference in someone's life. When they pulled apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time, the kind of emotional release that only comes after holding everything in for too long. "Now let's feed this boy before he really starts to complain," Helen said, picking up the bottle and handing it to Megan. They returned to the living room, where Megan sat on the sofa and began to feed Gabriel. Helen sat beside them watching the scene with a mix of contentment and melancholy. She remembered when Richard was a baby, how she used to feed him on this same sofa, while Charles read the newspaper in the armchair beside them. "Can I ask you something?" Megan said after a few minutes. "About the company. Rich talked about it so much, about how important it was to the family. What happened after he passed?" Helen sighed, the question bringing back difficult memories. "I tried to keep it going on my own for a while, but it wasn't the same. Richard had a vision for the company's future, new ideas that I didn't have. Without him, it was just following the same routine day after day." She paused, looking at her own hands. "I ended up selling most of my shares to a group of investors. I kept a small stake, more out of sentimentality than anything else. But deep down, when Richard was gone, the company lost its soul." "Would he have been sad about that?" Megan asked gently. "No," Helen replied with conviction. "He would have understood. Richard was always better than me at understanding that some things have their time, their cycle, that holding on to something past its natural time doesn't honor what it was, it just prolongs the agony." The two sat in comfortable silence for a while, only the sound of Gabriel feeding filling the space. Helen looked around the room, really seeing for the first time in a long time how much the place had become a mausoleum of memories rather than a living home. "You know," she began hesitantly, an idea taking shape in her mind, "this house has 6 bedrooms. Besides mine and Richard's, there are 4 completely empty ones. It always seemed like a waste, but I never knew what to do with them." Megan looked at Helen with curiosity, not sure where this line of thought was going. "I was thinking," Helen continued, the words coming slowly as the idea solidified. "What if I turned some of those rooms into something useful? Something that helped other people the way Richard helped you? What do you have in mind?" "I don't know exactly yet," Helen admitted, "but there's so much here going to waste, so much empty space, and there are so many people who need help. Maybe there's a way to connect those two things." Megan smiled, seeing a bit of the old strength returning to Helen's eyes. "I think that would be a beautiful way to honor Rich's memory. He would be very proud." The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell ringing. Helen wasn't expecting anyone else. She got up to answer it, opening the door to find a young man around 30 years old, with an irritated expression on his face. "Are you Helen Wilson?" he asked bluntly. "Richard's mother?" "Yes, that's me," Helen replied, already sensing that something wasn't right. "And you are?" "Ryan Taylor, Megan's husband," he said, pushing the door open to enter uninvited. "Where is she?" Helen stood in front of him, blocking the way to the living room. "Megan is here visiting. What do you want?" "I want my wife and my son back," he said with contained anger. "And I want you to stop filling her head with ideas about that Richard she can't forget." "I think you should calm down," Helen said firmly, not intimidated by the man's aggressive posture. "And maybe you should think more about how you treat your wife before coming to my home making accusations." "Accusations?" Richard let out a humorless laugh. "You don't know anything. Megan became obsessed with your son, talks about him all the time, goes to that cemetery every week with Gabriel, and now she's here in your home probably crying about how amazing he was." "He saved her life," Helen retorted, feeling her own anger rising. "Saved your son's life. Where were you when she needed you the most?" The question hit hard. Richard took a step back, his face turning red. "I was dealing with things my way." "Running away, you mean?" a voice came from behind Helen. Megan had approached, holding Gabriel in her arms. "You were running because you couldn't handle the possibility of losing the baby. You left me completely alone during the scariest moments of my life. Megan, let's go, Richard ordered, ignoring the accusations. Now. No, Megan replied, her voice surprisingly firm. I'm not leaving, and I won't let you disrespect the memory of someone who did more for me and Gabriel in a few months than you did in our entire life together. Are you comparing me to a dead man? Richard shouted, losing his composure. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. I'm stating facts, Megan responded, not letting herself be intimidated. And the fact is that I deserved a partner who would be by my side, and you chose to be absent. So that's it. You're leaving me because of an obsession with a guy you barely knew. I'm not leaving you because of Rich, Megan said, and Helen could hear the exhaustion and sadness in her voice. I'm leaving you because you were never really present, and because I can't raise our son in an environment where gratitude and respect are seen as obsession. Richard fell silent for a moment, seeming to process what Megan had said. Then his expression hardened. Fine. Want to leave? Go ahead. But don't expect me to make things easy for you. I'll fight for custody of Gabriel. I'll make sure you don't have a penny more than the legal minimum, and I'll prove you're an unstable mother, obsessed with a dead man. Get out of my house, Helen said, with a voice so cold and authoritative that even Richard seemed intimidated. Now. This isn't over, Richard threatened, but began backing toward the door. Megan, when you get tired of playing family with this woman, you know where to find me. He left, slamming the door, leaving a heavy silence behind. Megan was trembling, tears finally falling freely as she held Gabriel tightly. I can't believe I did that, she whispered. I just ended my marriage. You stood your ground, Helen corrected, guiding Megan back to the sofa. You didn't let him belittle or intimidate you. That's not ending a marriage, that's saving yourself and your son from a toxic situation. But what now? Megan looked at Helen with frightened eyes. Where will I stay? How will I support Gabriel? He was right about one thing. I have no money, no job. I dropped out of college. You'll stay here, Helen said, surprising herself with the quickness of the offer. At least until you get organized, figure out what you want to do. There are plenty of spare rooms and Gabriel needs stability. I can't do that to you. It's already too much. Megan. Helen took the young woman's hands, forcing her to make eye contact. I've spent the last 2 years in a huge, empty house, just existing from one day to the next. Having you and Gabriel here would be a gift to me. Let me do this. For you, for Gabriel, and for my son, who's no longer here to take care of you. Megan looked at Helen for a long moment, seeming to search for any sign of hesitation or forced obligation, but all she saw was genuine sincerity and a kind of loneliness that mirrored her own. Okay, she finally agreed, but only temporarily, until I can get on my feet. Temporarily, Helen agreed, though both knew that word was more for comfort than a concrete reality. In the following weeks, Helen's house underwent a transformation. Megan moved into one of the guest rooms, converting the attached closet into a small bedroom for Gabriel. Helen hired someone to help redecorate, bringing color and life to spaces that had been gray for too long. But the biggest transformation wasn't physical. It was how the house came back to life. Baby cries echoed through the halls in the early morning. There were toys scattered around the living room. Conversations and laughter filled the silence that had been so oppressive. Megan had her difficult moments. Richard made good on his threat to make things complicated, filing for shared custody and questioning Megan's ability to properly care for Gabriel. But Helen was there, offering not just housing, but also emotional support and, when needed, financial help to hire a good lawyer. One morning, about a month after Megan moved in, Helen was having coffee in the kitchen when the young mother came down the stairs with Gabriel in her arms and a determined look on her face. I want to go back to college, Megan announced. I dropped out of my education degree when I got pregnant, but I always wanted to finish. If I'm going to be a good example for Gabriel, I need to do this. Then you'll go back, Helen said simply. We'll find someone to watch Gabriel during your classes. You've already done so much for me, I can't ask for more. You're not asking, I'm offering. Helen stood up and approached Megan. Do you know why I'm doing all this? It's not just for Richard, though he's part of it. It's because when I look at you, I see the strength I wish I'd had at your age. I see someone fighting to build a better future for her son, and I want to help with that." Megan hugged Helen, a gesture that had become common between them in recent weeks. "Thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for all this." "You already are," Helen said honestly. "You've brought life back to this house. You've given me purpose again. That's worth more than any money." That afternoon, while Megan was putting Gabriel down for his nap, Helen sat in her office with a cup of tea and began making some notes. The idea she had mentioned to Megan weeks ago was taking more concrete shape in her mind. What if she actually transformed part of the house into a support place for single mothers, or those in difficult situations? Megan wasn't the only woman who needed a support network, a safe place to stabilize while building a better future. She started researching, making calls to old acquaintances from the business world, talking with social workers, understanding better what the needs were, and how she could help in a meaningful way. 2 weeks later, during dinner, Helen presented the fully formed idea to Megan. "I want to turn 3 of the empty rooms into spaces to house single mothers with young children," Helen explained as the two ate the lasagna Megan had made. "Nothing permanent. Maybe 6 months to a year for each family. Enough time for them to get financially stable, find jobs, go back to school, whatever's needed." "That's... wow." Megan was clearly impressed. "That's a huge project. Are you sure?" "Surer than I've been about anything in a long time," Helen replied. "And I want you to help me. When you go back to college and start working in education, you'll have valuable insights into how to best support these families. But even before that, you have lived experience. You know what it's like to need help and not know where to find it." Megan was silent for a moment, processing the proposal. "It would be an honor to help," she finally said, "and I think it would be a perfect way to honor Rich's memory. He saved one life, and now you'll help save many others." "We'll help," Helen corrected. "This isn't just me, it's both of us, working together." The project took months to materialize. There were legal matters to resolve, renovations to make in the rooms, safety protocols to establish. Helen put a considerable amount of her personal money into the project, but she didn't mind. For the first time in years, she felt her money was being used for something truly meaningful. Megan went back to college, taking her classes during the day, while Helen or a hired nanny stayed with Gabriel. Evenings were dedicated to studying and working on the details of the shelter project. During this period, the custody process for Gabriel was moving forward. Ryan had argued that Megan lacked financial stability or adequate housing, but Megan's lawyer easily demonstrated that she was living in a spacious home with all the necessary support, going back to college, and actively building a stable future. The custody hearing was tense. Ryan and his lawyer tried to paint Megan as an obsessed, emotionally unstable woman, unable to prioritize her son. Helen was present at the hearing, seated right behind Megan in silent support. When it was time for Megan to testify, she spoke clearly and with conviction about her situation. Yes, she was grateful to a man who had saved her life. No, that didn't make her unstable or obsessive. She was honoring the memory of someone who made a tremendous sacrifice and raising her son with the values of gratitude and kindness that man had exemplified. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, listened to all the arguments. When it was time to give her decision, she looked directly at Ryan. "Mr. Taylor," the judge began, "your ex-wife's gratitude towards someone who saved her life and her son's does not constitute obsession or emotional instability. It constitutes basic decency. The fact that you see this as a threat says more about you than about her." Ryan turned red but remained silent. "Primary custody of Gabriel is granted to the mother," the judge continued. "You will have supervised visits every 2 weeks until you demonstrate that you can put your son's needs above your own ego. Case closed." Megan nearly collapsed with relief. Helen squeezed her shoulder in support, a satisfied smile on her face. Outside the courthouse, Ryan made one last approach. "Megan," he called as she was putting Gabriel in the stroller. "It didn't have to be this way. We could have worked things out." "You're right," Megan replied, turning to face him. "We could have. If you had been there when I needed you, if you had respected my gratitude instead of seeing it as a threat, if you had been a true partner instead of a critical spectator." I was afraid, Richard admitted, looking smaller all of a sudden. Afraid of losing you, of losing the baby. I didn't know how to handle it. Fear is human, Megan said more gently. But you let fear turn you into someone cruel. And that was a choice. Maybe someday you can work on that, be a better father to Gabriel. But until then, I will protect our son from any negativity. With that, she turned the stroller and walked toward the car where Helen was waiting. Richard stood still in the middle of the sidewalk, watching them leave, the weight of his own choices finally settling on his shoulders. In the car on the way home, Megan was quiet, processing everything that had happened. "Are you okay?" Helen finally asked. "I am," Megan replied, and she seemed genuinely surprised by it. "I mean, it will take time to process everything, to adjust to this new reality. But yes, I think I'm okay. Better than I've been in a long time, actually." "Proud of you," Helen said simply. "You stood your ground, defended what was right. That takes courage." "I learned from the best." Megan smiled, looking at Helen. "Seeing you rebuild your life after so much loss, find purpose again. That inspired me to do the same." The two arrived home to find the housekeeper waiting with news. The first family had been approved for the foster program, a young mother of 23 with a 2-year-old daughter, fleeing an abusive relationship and needing a safe place to start over. Julia and little Anna. Helen read the documents the social worker had sent. She works as a nursing assistant, but the salary barely covers rent and basic expenses. The ex-partner is threatening to take her daughter away over financial issues. "When do they arrive?" Megan asked, already thinking about how to prepare the room. "Next week, if all goes well with the paperwork." The two spent the next week preparing one of the rooms. Megan used her recent experience as a new mother to think of all the details that would make a difference. A comfortable crib for Anna, a small study space for Julia, soft and welcoming colors on the walls. When Julia arrived on Thursday afternoon, she looked exhausted and nervous. She was a young brunette with curly hair, wearing simple but clean clothes, holding the hand of a little girl with big eyes, who looked at everything around her with curiosity mixed with fear. "Welcome," Helen said with a warm smile, crouching down to be at Anna's eye level. "Hi, Anna, my name is Helen. This is Megan, and that baby over there is Gabriel." Anna hid behind her mother's leg, but her eyes remained fixed on Gabriel, who was in the infant carrier, watching everything with his characteristic curiosity. Thank you for having us," Julia said, her voice filled with emotion. "The social worker said you're offering temporary housing, but I'm not sure I understood correctly. People don't do this without wanting something in return." "I don't want anything in return," Helen said honestly. "Just that you use this time to get stable, build a safe future for you and for Anna. Come, let me show you your room." As they went up the stairs, Megan following behind with Gabriel, Julia looked at everything with a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. The room they had prepared was spacious and welcoming, with a double bed, a crib for Anna, a small desk, and even some toys in the corner. Is this for us?" Julia asked, tears beginning to fall. "All of this?" "All of this," Helen confirmed. "And don't worry about expenses. Food, clothes, the basics are covered. You just need to focus on working and saving your money for when you're ready to leave here." "Why are you all doing this?" Julia asked, genuinely confused. "Don't get me wrong, I'm immensely grateful, but—" "Why?" Megan approached, adjusting Gabriel in her arms. "Because someone once did something extraordinary for me when I needed it most, and this is how we honor that kindness, by paying it forward." Julia looked between Helen and Megan, seeming to finally understand this was real, that there was no trick or hidden conditions. "I won't let you down." She promised, "I'll work hard. I'll save money. I'll do everything right. I swear." "We know," Helen said confidently. "The social worker wouldn't have recommended you if she didn't believe in you. Now, why don't you get settled? Dinner is at 7. Nothing too formal, just us sitting together to eat and talk." In the following weeks, the house became even more alive. Anna, after overcoming her initial shyness, revealed herself to be a cheerful and talkative child. She loved playing with the toys Helen had bought and was fascinated with Gabriel, always wanting to help care for the baby. Julia was thriving. She had managed to get some extra shifts at the hospital and was aggressively saving money. In the evenings, after putting Anna to sleep, she would join Helen and Megan in the living room, and the three would talk about everything from daily difficulties to dreams for the future. It was during one of these nighttime conversations that Helen first mentioned the plan to expand the program. 3 bedrooms is good, she said. But I was thinking, what if we could do more? Maybe buy a bigger property, or even 2, and really scale this up. You want to turn this into an even bigger project? Megan asked, surprised but clearly excited by the idea. There are so many women who need help, Helen argued, and I have the resources. Why not use what I have to make a real difference? I think it's amazing. Julia contributed timidly. If I hadn't found you all, I don't know where I'd be now, probably still stuck in a cycle of working just to pay rent, unable to save anything, always one emergency away from total collapse. Exactly. Helen leaned forward, excited. What if we could offer not just housing, but also job training, help to go back to school? Maybe even partnerships with local businesses to secure jobs. That would be revolutionary, Megan said, her mind already working through the possibilities. I could use my teaching background to help with educational programs for the children, and maybe even for the mothers who want to finish their studies. The 3 continued talking late into the night, planning and dreaming. It was incredible how 3 women of such different ages and backgrounds had connected so deeply, united by a common purpose and shared gratitude. 2 months later, a second family was welcomed. Marcia, a 35-year-old woman with 2 children, 7-year-old Lucas and 5-year-old Sophie. She was recovering financially after a series of lost jobs and health problems. She was shy and reserved at first, clearly used to distrusting kindness. But slowly, seeing how Julia and her daughter were thriving, Marcia began to open up. She got a job at a local bakery and was working to pay off old debts. Her children joined Anna during playtime, and the house became even noisier and more alive. Helen was beginning to understand what had been missing in her life. It wasn't just companionship or purpose, though those things were important. It was the feeling of being part of something bigger than herself, of using her privileges and resources to create real and tangible change in people's lives. Megan graduated with honors in education, and on graduation day, Helen was there in the front row, holding Gabriel and applauding with tears in her eyes. It was like watching a daughter graduate, though Helen never said it out loud, afraid it might seem like she was trying to replace Megan's biological mother. But Megan felt the same connection. One night after graduation, when the 2 were alone in the kitchen making coffee after everyone had gone to sleep, Megan finally put it into words. Miss Helen, she began hesitantly, I know we're not blood relatives, and I had a mother I loved very much before she passed away when I was 15. But, well, you've become like a second mother to me, and I just wanted you to know how much that means. Helen felt her heart tighten, but in a good way. She set her coffee mug aside and pulled Megan into a hug. You've become like a daughter to me too, Helen admitted. And Gabriel. Well, he's completely stolen my heart. If you'll let me, I'd love to be a grandmother in spirit to him. Nothing would make me happier, Megan said, her voice muffled against Helen's shoulder. The 2 stayed like that for a long moment, 2 broken hearts that had found healing in each other. The program continued to grow. Helen bought a second property a few blocks away, a smaller but cozy house that could accommodate 2 more families. She hired a full-time social worker and a psychologist to provide emotional support for the mothers in transition. Megan, newly graduated, took on the role of educational coordinator, developing programs for both the children and the mothers who wanted to return to school. She also gave workshops on mindful parenting and trauma management. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. A year and a half after their first meeting at the cemetery, life had completely changed for both women. Helen was no longer the retired businesswoman without purpose, living in a big empty house, visiting her son's grave as her only social activity. She was now the founder and funder of a program that had already helped 10 families get back on their feet. Megan was no longer the insecure young mother, trapped in a toxic marriage, fearing for the future. She was a fulfilled professional, living comfortably, raising her son in a loving environment, and making a real difference in the lives of other women. Julia had already moved into her own apartment, a small but comfortable place she managed to rent with the money she had saved. She still visited regularly, always bringing Anna to play with Gabriel and the other children. She had started a technical nursing course, seeking to advance in her career. It was on a Tuesday, 2 years after that first confrontation at the cemetery, that Helen and Megan made their weekly visit to Richard's grave. They had kept up the tradition, going together every week, always bringing colourful balloons. But this time they weren't alone. Gabriel, now 2.5 years old, walked between them holding their hands. Anna, Julia, Marcia with Lucas and Sophie, and 3 other mothers with their children who had been through the program, were also there. "Who was he, Grandma?" Gabriel asked, using the title he had naturally adopted for Helen. Helen knelt beside the boy, pointing to the name on the headstone. "That was Richard, a very special man who did something very brave. He helped your mother when she needed it most, and thanks to him, you are here today." "Was he a hero?" Gabriel asked with wide eyes. "Yes, my love." Megan joined them, stroking her son's hair. "He was a hero, and when you grow up, I'll tell you all the stories about him." Gabriel looked at the grave for a moment, then did something completely unexpected. He let go of the 2 women's hands, approached the headstone, and placed his small hand over the engraved name. "Thank you, Uncle Rich," he said with the simple sincerity of a child, "for helping my mom." Helen and Megan exchanged glances, both with tears in their eyes. Around them, the other women and children stood in respectful silence, each processing the meaning of that moment in their own way. "He would have loved this," Helen finally said, her voice choked. "To see how an act of kindness multiplied, how so many lives were touched by that choice he made." "It wasn't just one act of kindness," Megan gently corrected. "It was a series of them. He chose to help repeatedly, even knowing the risks. He chose to care when it would have been easier not to get involved. And now look what grew from it," Julia added, gesturing to the group around the grave. "All of us, all these children, lives that were changed because someone showed that it's possible to make a difference." Helen looked around the group, truly seeing each face. Marcia, who had gotten a steady job at an accounting firm and was months away from moving into her own place. Claudia, a 40-year-old woman who had returned to college after 20 years and was about to graduate with a business degree. Renee, who had started a small homemade cake business that was thriving. And so many others, each with their own story, their challenges, their victories. "I think it's time we made a change to the tradition," Helen suddenly announced. "Instead of just the 2 of us coming here every week, how about we turn this into a monthly celebration? A time when all the families who have been through the program can gather, remember why we started all this, and celebrate how much we've grown together." "I love that idea." Megan immediately agreed. "Could we do like a picnic here at the cemetery? I know it sounds strange, but—" "It doesn't sound strange," Renee interrupted. "It sounds perfect. Turning a place of sadness into a place of community and gratitude." And so a new tradition began. Once a month, on the first Saturday, all the women who had been helped by the Richard Wilson Foundation, as it had been named, would gather at the cemetery. They brought food, blankets, toys for the children. They shared updates about their lives, offered support to one another, remembered where they had come from and celebrated where they were going. The program continued expanding. Helen bought a 3rd property, this one specifically dedicated to providing shared workspace and classrooms for the mothers who wanted to study or start small businesses. Megan developed a full curriculum of classes and workshops. Julia, with her nursing training, began offering basic health consultations for the families. The local media eventually picked up the story, a neighborhood newspaper first, then a regional TV channel. Helen was reluctant about the attention, fearing it would turn the program into something performative rather than genuine. But Megan convinced her that sharing the story could inspire others to do something similar. The TV report aired on a Thursday night. It showed Helen, Megan, and Gabriel at the cemetery, telling the story of how it all began. Then it showed the houses, the families, the smiling faces of women who had regained their dignity and hope. At the end of the report, the reporter asked Helen, "What would you say to your son if you could talk to him now?" Helen had thought about that question many times over the past few years. She was silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I would say I'm sorry for not listening when he tried to tell me about his struggles, that I'm sorry for being so lost in my own pain that I missed signs of his suffering." She paused, tears beginning to fall. "But I would also say that I'm proud of the man he was, of the values he lived by, of the difference he made in the world in his short time here, and that I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor that legacy, helping other people the way he helped." Megan, sitting next to Helen, took her hand and squeezed it. Gabriel, on his mother's lap, looked between the two women with that strange intuition children have for emotional moments. "Uncle Rich is happy with us, right, Grandma?" he asked. "Yes, my love." Helen smiled through her tears. "I think he's very happy with us." The report had an unexpected impact. Donations started coming in, from small amounts to substantial contributions. Volunteers offered their services. Local businesses reached out, wanting to establish partnerships to offer jobs to women in the program. With the additional resources, Helen and Megan were able to expand even further. They opened a childcare center where mothers could leave their children while working or studying. They established an emergency fund to help with unexpected medical expenses or other crises. 3 years after starting, the Richard Wilson Foundation had helped more than 30 families. Some women had moved on and were thriving on their own. Others were still in the program, building their foundations. And new families were constantly arriving, each bringing their own stories, challenges, and hopes. Ryan Taylor, Megan's ex-husband, had eventually become more present in Gabriel's life. It took time, therapy, and a lot of honest reflection, but he had begun working on himself. Supervised visits eventually became regular visits, and although the relationship between him and Megan would never be repaired, they managed to develop a functional co-parenting arrangement centered on Gabriel's well-being. During one visit, Ryan asked to speak with Helen privately. They sat in the garden while Megan and Gabriel played inside. "I wanted to apologize to you," Ryan began without preamble. "For the way I behaved, for the things I said, I was wrong on so many levels." Helen studied the man in front of her. He seemed different, more mature, less defensive. "I accept your apology," she said simply. "But the one who really deserves to hear this is Megan. I've already apologized to her, several times." Ryan sighed. "She's more gracious to me than I deserve, but I wanted you to know too. Because some of my anger was directed at you and your son, and that was unfair." "You were afraid," Helen said, echoing the words Megan had used years before. "Afraid of not being good enough, of being replaced. But love doesn't work that way. It's not competitive. There's room for many people in a child's heart." "I'm starting to understand that," Ryan admitted. "Seeing how Gabriel talks about you, about the other children and families here. He's growing up in such a rich environment, so full of love and support. I wanted to be angry about it, but I can't. I can only be grateful." "Gabriel is a lucky boy," Helen agreed. "He has 2 parents who love him, even if they're not together. He has a mother who is strong and dedicated, and he has a whole community of people who care about him. That's more than many children have." Richard nodded, looking at the house where he could see Gabriel laughing at something Megan had said. "Your son was really special, wasn't he?" he asked. "I mean, not just because he donated blood, but as a person. Megan still talks about him sometimes, and when she does, there's this light in her eyes. It's not romantic, I finally understood that. It's pure gratitude and admiration for someone who showed kindness when she needed it most." "Richard was special," Helen confirmed. "Not perfect, nobody is, but he had a good heart and a genuine desire to make a difference. And I try to live in a way that honors that continues this legacy." "You've succeeded," Richard said sincerely. "Look at all this you've built, all the lives you've changed." "It's impressive." "It wasn't just me," Helen corrected. "It was Megan, it was Julia, it was all the women who went through the program and decided to help each other. I just provided the resources. They did the real work." After Richard left, Megan approached Helen in the garden. "You two seem to be having a good conversation." "We were," Helen confirmed. "He apologized. He seems genuinely to be trying to be better." "People can change when they really want to," Megan said. "It doesn't always change enough to get back what they lost, but the change itself is still valuable." "You've become very wise, young lady," Helen smiled. "I learned from you," Megan returned the smile, sitting on the bench next to Helen. "You know, sometimes I still can't believe how my life has changed, from that terrified young woman in the hospital to this." She gestured around. "A career I love, an amazing son, a real home. And all because a stranger decided to be kind. And because you had the courage to accept that help," Helen added, "and then the courage to stand up for yourself when you needed to, and the courage to rebuild your life. Richard may have started the chain of events, but you made choices every day that brought you here." Gabriel came running out of the house at that moment, shouting something about having found a little creature in the garden. The two women got up to investigate, finding a small turtle that had ventured into the space. "Can we keep her, Mom?" Gabriel begged. "I promised to take care of her." Megan and Helen exchanged looks, communicating silently. Then both smiled. "Of course," Megan said, "but it's your responsibility," agreed. "You need to research how to care for her, feed her, clean her space." "I'll do everything," Gabriel promised, already completely in love with the turtle. "And I'll give her a name, Rich. Like the uncle who helped when I was a baby." Helen felt her heart tighten, but in a good way. That boy, who would never know Richard in life, would still carry his name and his memory. Not through sadness or grief, but through love and care for another living creature. "Rich is a great name," Helen said, crouching next to Gabriel, "and I know Uncle Rich would be very happy to know that you'll take such good care of this little turtle." In the following years, the program continued to grow and evolve. They opened a 5th house, then a 6th. They established partnerships with local universities to offer scholarships for the women who wanted to pursue higher education. They created a mentorship program, where women who had been through the program came back to help and advise newcomers. Megan eventually wrote a book about her experience, an honest and touching account about high-risk pregnancy, loss, gratitude, and rebuilding. The book became a local bestseller and was used in various university courses about social work and pedagogy. Helen, now 70 years old, had found a vitality she hadn't felt in decades. She woke up every day with purpose. There was always something to do, someone to help, a new idea to implement. The loneliness and emptiness that had been her constant companions after Richard's loss had been replaced by connection and meaning. Gabriel grew up surrounded by stories about his Uncle Rich, whom he had never met. He knew about the blood donations, about the kindness, about choosing to help even when it was difficult. These stories shaped the boy he was becoming, teaching him values he would carry throughout his life. One Saturday morning, 5 years after that first meeting at the cemetery, all the women who had ever been through the Richard Wilson Foundation gathered for a special celebration. It was the program's 5th anniversary, and they had prepared something special. At the cemetery beside Richard's grave, they had installed a commemorative plaque. It wasn't large or showy, but simple and meaningful. It read, "Richard Henry Wilson. Your kindness saved 2 lives. Your legacy transformed dozens. Love never ends, it only multiplies." Helen stood in front of the plaque for a long moment, Megan beside her holding 5-year-old Gabriel's hand. Around them, more than 50 people, all touched in some way by the legacy of a man who had left too soon, but had left an indelible mark on the world. "What do you think, Richard?" Helen whispered to the grave. "Have we made you proud?" As always, there was no audible answer, but Helen felt something she had learned to recognize over the past years, a sense of peace, of rightness, of being exactly where she should be doing exactly what she should be doing. "He is proud," Megan said softly beside her. "I know he is." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Several women spoke about how the program had changed their lives. Children read poems and letters thanking them for the help. There were tears, but also laughter. Pain, but also hope. It was exactly the kind of celebration Richard would have loved, focused not on loss but on life, not on sadness but on possibility. After the ceremony, they held the traditional picnic. Blankets spread across the grass, shared food, children running and playing. It was a scene so full of life and joy that it was almost impossible to remember how this place had once been only synonymous with pain and mourning for Helen. Gabriel was playing with a group of other children when he approached Helen with a question. "Grandma, why do people die?" The question was direct and honest, in the way only children can ask. Helen picked up the boy, thinking carefully about how to respond. "People die because it's part of life, my love," she explained gently. "Everything that lives eventually stops living. It's sad and hard for those who stay, but it's also natural." "And did Uncle Rich go to heaven?" Gabriel asked. "I think so," Helen answered, though she had never been particularly religious. "But you know what else I think? I think part of him remains here, in all the people he helped, in all the good deeds we've done because of his example." "Like me?" Gabriel asked. "Because he helped my mum so I was born." "Exactly like you," Helen confirmed. "You're living proof that kindness matters, that one person can make a real difference in the world." Gabriel thought about this for a moment, with that seriousness that sometimes surprises in children. "Then I'm going to be good too," he decided. "I'm going to help people like Uncle Rich did." "I know you will," Helen said, hugging him tightly. "And I'll be here to help you learn how." As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, the families began saying goodbye and leaving. Promises to see each other soon, long hugs, reluctant children stopping their play. Helen, Megan, and Gabriel were the last to leave. They stood still in front of the grave once more, this time in comfortable silence. "Thank you, Rich," Megan finally said, "for everything." "Rest in peace, son," Helen added, "and know that your work here continues, through us." "Bye, Uncle Rich," Gabriel waved. "See you next month." The three walked hand in hand toward the car, a family not by blood but by choice, united by tragedy and transformed by love. In the car, Gabriel fell asleep in the back seat, tired from the long and emotional day. Megan drove while Helen was in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the streets of New York City passing by. "Do you think I'll ever stop missing him?" Helen asked suddenly, the question surprising even herself. Megan thought carefully before answering. "No," she said honestly. "I think you'll always miss him. He was your son. That pain never completely goes away. But I think with time the pain transforms into something more bearable, more manageable, and it's partly replaced by pride, by gratitude for the time you had, for the legacy he left." "You've become so wise," Helen smiled through the tears that began to fall silently. "I had a good teacher," Megan replied, briefly taking Helen's hand before needing to put both hands back on the wheel. They arrived home when the night had completely fallen. Helen carried the still sleeping Gabriel inside, while Megan gathered all the bags and belongings that always accompany a day out with a young child. Inside the house, now much smaller than the original mansion, but infinitely warmer and cozier, they put Gabriel to bed. Helen kissed the boy's forehead, tucked the blanket around him, and looked at that peaceful, sleeping face. "Good night, my little warrior," she whispered. "Dream of beautiful things." In the living room, Megan prepared tea for both of them, and they sat on the sofa, tired but content. "You know," Megan began, "today during the ceremony I kept thinking, if someone had told me 5 years ago that my life would be like this, I would never have believed it. Everything seemed so impossible, so hopeless. And now?" Helen asked. "Now I see possibilities everywhere," Megan smiled. "I see strong women who refuse to give up. I see children growing up in loving and safe environments. I see a community that supports each other. I see you, who turned your pain into purpose." "And I see you," Helen returned, "a young mother who went through horrible things and came out the other side stronger, more compassionate, more determined. You inspire me every day." The two sat in comfortable silence, drinking their tea and absorbing the peace of the moment. Outside, the city continued its frantic pace, but here in this small corner of the world, there was peace, there was love, there was purpose. "Do you think he knew?" Megan asked suddenly. Rich. Do you think he knew that donating that blood could have consequences for his health? It was a question Helen had asked herself many times over the years. I think so, she answered honestly. The doctors must have warned him. He wasn't foolish. He understood the risks, but he did it anyway. Why? Megan pressed, still struggling with that guilt that never completely went away. Why would he risk his own life for someone he barely knew? Because that's who he was, Helen said simply. Richard always believed that the value of a life isn't measured by how long it lasts, but by the impact it has. He chose to have an impact. He chose that saving 2 lives was worth any personal risk. And created this whole chain of impact that keeps growing, Megan added. How many lives have been changed because of that first choice of his? Countless, Helen agreed, and it will keep growing. The women who went through the program will help others. The children who grew up here will carry these values into the world. It's an endless chain of kindness. So he won, Megan said with conviction. Even with his life being so short, even leaving when he did, he won, because his impact will live far beyond the time he had here. Helen thought about that, about all the ways Richard continued to live on, in her memories, in the shared stories, in Gabriel's name, in the Richard Wilson Foundation, in every transformed life, every child fed, every mother empowered. Yes, she finally agreed. He won, and we'll make sure his victory keeps counting. The years kept passing. Gabriel grew up, a bright and compassionate boy who carried his namesake uncle's legacy with pride. When he was 10, he started volunteering at the program, helping with the younger children, organizing donations, learning the values of service and community that had been fundamental in his upbringing. Helen, now in her 70s, had slowed down a bit, but was still actively involved in the program. Megan had taken on most of the administrative responsibilities, but Helen was a constant presence, the matriarch beloved by all the families who went through the program. The Richard Wilson Foundation had become a benchmark in New York City. Other cities began creating similar programs inspired by the model. Helen and Megan occasionally traveled to give talks and workshops on how to establish and maintain these support programs. Julia, the first woman to go through the program, was now a trained nurse and worked at the same hospital where Richard had donated blood for Megan years earlier. Anna, her daughter, was studying medicine, inspired by her mother's work and the stories about the man who had saved Gabriel. One afternoon, Helen was in the garden when she received an unexpected call. It was St. Luke's Hospital, where Richard had made the blood donations. Mrs. Wilson? The voice on the phone was formal but gentle. My name is Dr. Paul Shaw. I was the doctor who attended your son during his blood donations. Helen sat down, her heart racing. After all these years, why would the doctor be calling? Yes, I remember you, she said carefully. What can I do for you? Actually, I'd like to do something for you, Dr. Shaw explained. I'm retiring in a few months and I've been organizing my files and professional memories. I found some documents related to your son that I think you'd like to have. What kind of documents? Letters, mainly, the doctor said. Your son wrote some letters before each donation in case something went wrong. He asked me to keep them and give them to you if anything happened, but only when I felt the time was right, and I believe now is that time. Helen could barely breathe. Letters? From Richard? Yes, please, she managed to say. When can I pick them up? 2 days later, Helen was sitting in Dr. Shaw's office, a yellow envelope in front of her. Megan had insisted on coming with her, sitting by her side in silent support. There were 3 donations, Dr. Shaw explained, so there are 3 letters. He wrote them here in the office always before going to the blood bank. He said if anything went wrong, he wanted you to know the truth. Helen picked up the envelope with trembling hands. After all these years, would she have final words from her son? He was a remarkable young man. Dr. Shaw continued, in all my years of medicine, I've rarely seen someone so determined to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. Thank you, Helen managed to say, for keeping this, for waiting for the right time. You're welcome. I've been following the work of the foundation. I think your son would be very proud. Back home, Helen and Megan sat in the study, the 3 letters laid out on the table between them. "Do you want me to leave?" Megan offered. "To have privacy?" "No," Helen said immediately. "Stay, please. Whatever is in these letters, you have the right to hear." With hands still trembling, Helen opened the first letter. Richard's handwriting, so familiar and yet so painful to see, covered the page. "Mum, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong with the blood donation. And before you start blaming yourself or getting angry, I need you to understand a few things. First, I knew the risks. The doctors were very clear about how donating blood with my heart condition wasn't ideal. But when I met Megan and learned how desperate she was, how much her baby was in danger, I had no doubt about what to do. Second, this was my choice. No one forced me, no one pressured me. I chose to help because that's who I want to be. You always taught me that a person's worth lies in the choices they make, the actions they take. Well, this is my choice. Third, don't be angry with Megan. She tried to refuse my help, but I insisted, and I would insist again without hesitation. You'll be sad. I know that, but I want you to be proud too. Proud of raising a son who cares enough to make a difference in someone's life. Proud that even if my life is short, it had meaning. Take care of yourself, Mom, and if you can, take care of Megan and the baby too. They'll need support. I love you forever, Richard. Helen had tears streaming freely down her face when she finished reading aloud. Megan was in a similar state, holding Gabriel, who had entered the study upon hearing the crying. "He knew," Helen whispered. "He knew and did it anyway." "And asked you to take care of me," Megan added, her voice choked. Even in his final letter, he was thinking of others. Helen opened the second letter, dated 2 months later. "Mom, second donation today. If you're reading this, well, you know what it means. I've been thinking a lot about legacy. What do we leave behind when we go? Is it money? Is it property? Is it the company we helped build? I don't think it's any of that. I think the only legacy that really matters is the lives we touch, the people we help, the love we share. Megan's baby is growing strong now. She showed me the ultrasound today. It's amazing to think that this little one is only alive because of the donations, that every beat of their tiny heart is possible because I chose to help. That is legacy. That is true immortality. If I'm leaving now, I want you to know I leave happy. Happy to have made a difference. Happy to have helped. Happy to have lived by the values you taught me. Use the pain to create something beautiful, Mom. You've always been good at that. Turning hardship into strength, sadness into purpose. I love you always, Richard." He was preparing you, Megan realized. Even then, he was giving you a path to move forward. Helen nodded, unable to speak, and opened the third and final letter. "Mom, third donation. Last one the doctors promised. After this, Megan's baby will be strong enough to reach the end of the pregnancy without major risks. I'm writing this knowing it will probably turn out fine. The first 2 donations went smoothly with no complications, but I'm writing anyway because some things need to be said. You were the best mother I could have asked for. I know you think you failed somehow, that you should have noticed signs, done things differently, but you didn't fail. You raised me to be strong, to be compassionate, to care about other people, and that's exactly what I'm doing. When Dad died, you became my rock. You held our family together, kept the company running, and still found time to support me in everything I needed. You are the strongest person I know, and if I leave now, if you're reading this letter after something has gone wrong, I need you to use that strength. Not to get stuck in the past, not to blame yourself, but to create something good, something that helps other people. You have so much to offer the world, Mum. Don't let pain stop you from doing that. And about Megan, if you can, be there for her. She's going to need support, especially if she's raising the baby alone. She's a special person. You'll like her. And the baby, well, I hope it's a little warrior as strong as the mother. One last thing. Live, Mom. Really live. Don't just exist. Find joy, find purpose, find love. That's what I want for you. All my love, always and forever. Richard. The silence that followed was profound. Helen held the 3 letters against her chest. Years of pain and guilt finally finding a kind of resolution. Megan was by her side, Gabriel in her lap, all together in that moment of deep understanding. "He knew," Helen finally said. "He knew he was risking everything, and chose to do it anyway. And he left a map," Megan added softly. "A map of how to move forward, of how to turn pain into something beautiful. And we did it, didn't we?" Helen looked around the office, thinking of everything they had built. "We did exactly what he asked." "We did," Megan confirmed, "and we'll keep doing it." Gabriel, who had been quiet during the whole reading, finally spoke. "Uncle Rich was really wise, huh?" he said with the straightforward simplicity of children. "Yes, my love," Helen smiled through her tears. "He was very wise, and you're growing up to be just like him." "I know," Gabriel said with a child's confidence, "because you and Mom teach me the same things he knew." That night after Gabriel went to bed, Helen and Megan stayed in the living room talking late, processing the impact of the letters. "You know what amazes me the most," Megan said. "Even writing these letters, knowing the risks, he kept going, made 3 donations, never gave up." "Because for him, some things were worth the risk," Helen replied. "And saving lives, making a real difference, that was at the top of the list." "We need to do something with these letters," Megan suggested. "They're too powerful to be kept hidden. Other people need to hear these words." Helen thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. Maybe we could include excerpts from them in the program materials, or make a book, something that could inspire other people." "Or both," Megan smiled. "Why not both?" In the following months, Megan worked on a second book. This one specifically focused on Richard's story and the legacy he left behind. The letters were included in full with Helen's permission. The book was launched on the 6th anniversary of the Richard Wilson Foundation at an emotional ceremony that brought together all the families who had ever been through the program. The book became a bigger success than the first one. Schools began using it in ethics and citizenship classes. Young adult groups used it as discussion material about values and choices. Richard's story reached far beyond New York City, touching hearts throughout the United States. With the book royalties, Megan established an educational fund specifically for children of single mothers, ensuring that kids like Gabriel would have access to quality education regardless of their family's financial situation. Helen, now 78, had significantly slowed down. But she was still a constant presence at the monthly meetings at the cemetery, still involved in the important decisions of the foundation, and still the beloved matriarch to everyone. At one of these monthly meetings, a surprising event occurred. Ryan Taylor, Megan's ex-husband, showed up. It was a shock to everyone, especially to Megan. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not hostile but clearly confused. "I've wanted to come for a long time," Ryan admitted, "but I was ashamed. Ashamed of how I acted, how I treated you, and the memory of a man who was better than I ever was." Gabriel, now 13, watched the scene cautiously. His relationship with his father had improved over the years, but there was still a distance, a caution born from years of early disappointment. "I read the book," Ryan continued, "the letters he wrote, and I realized something. He was worried about you, about Gabriel. Even knowing he might not survive, he was thinking about how to make sure you would be okay." "That's who he was," Helen said, stepping closer. "And because of him, Megan and Gabriel not only survived, but thrived." "I know." Ryan looked at Megan, then at Gabriel. "And I wasn't part of that. I was an obstacle, not a support. But I want to change that. If you'll let me, I want to start being the father Gabriel deserves, the ex-husband who at least respects what you've built here." Megan studied the man in front of her. He seemed genuine, humble in a way she had never seen before. "This won't be easy," she said honestly. "Building trust takes time. And Gabriel—" "I understand I need to earn his trust," Ryan interrupted. "I don't expect it to be instant. I just ask for the chance to try." Megan looked at Gabriel, giving him the choice. "I can try to get to know you better," Gabriel finally said, "but you need to respect Grandma Helen and everyone here. You need to respect Uncle Rich's memory, because he saved my life and that means everything to me." "I promise," Ryan said solemnly. "And who knows, Maybe I can help with the foundation too. I have skills in finance. I could help with managing the funds. Helen and Megan exchanged looks, communicating silently. Then Helen nodded. Everyone deserves a second chance, she said. Richard, my son, believed in that. If you are genuinely wanting to do better, we will have a place for you here. It was an unexpected moment of healing. Ryan didn't become an integral part of the foundation overnight, but he slowly began to contribute, first with financial consulting, then helping to develop business plans for the women who wanted to start their own ventures. His relationship with Gabriel gradually improved. It would never be the ideal father-son relationship it could have been, but it became something genuine and valuable in its own way. 2 years later, when Gabriel was 15, he gave a speech at school about legacy and choices. He talked about the uncle he never met, about the grandmother who turned pain into purpose, about the mother who refused to give up. The speech was so impactful that it went viral on social media, bringing even more attention to the Richard Wilson Foundation. Universities began to study the foundation as a model for effective community intervention. Politicians visited to learn how to replicate the success. But through it all, Helen and Megan kept the focus on what really mattered, on the individual families, the personal stories, the transformation one life at a time. When Helen turned 80, a massive celebration was organized. Over 200 people attended, each with a story about how the foundation had changed their lives. There were women who had gone through the program years ago and were now thriving. There were children who had grown up in the foster homes and were now in college building careers, starting families. During the party, Megan gave an emotional speech. When I met Mrs. Helen over a decade ago, she was full of anger and pain, and I was full of fear and despair. Two strangers who met in a cemetery, united by the memory of a man we both lost. But what we discovered is that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something new, something beautiful, something that honors those we lost while helping those still here. Megan paused, looking around the room full of smiling faces. Mrs. Helen could have let her pain consume her. I could have let my fear paralyze me. But instead, we chose to honor the memory of Richard Henry Wilson in the only way that truly matters, through action, through love, through service. The crowd applauded, but Megan raised her hand, asking for silence. And today, on the 80th birthday of this extraordinary woman, I want to announce something special. With Mrs. Helen's approval and the support of all our partners, we're expanding the Richard Wilson Foundation to 5 more cities in New York City. And it doesn't stop there. We've received commitments from organizations in other states interested in replicating the model. The legacy of kindness that began with a young man donating blood is becoming a national movement. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Helen, seated in the honor chair, had tears streaming down her face. Gabriel was by her side, holding her hand, himself visibly moved. When the crowd finally quieted down, Helen asked to speak. Megan helped her stand, offering the microphone. I didn't prepare a speech, Helen began, her voice still strong despite her age. So I'll just speak from the heart. 10 years ago I was a broken woman. I had lost my husband, then my son. The company we built was sold. I was living in a huge empty house without purpose, without direction, just waiting for time to pass. She paused, wiping away tears. And then, in a cemetery, I yelled at a young woman who was leaving colorful balloons on my son's grave. I was so angry and so much pain. How dare she turn my grief into some kind of celebration? Some people in the crowd chuckled softly, knowing the story. But that young woman, that brave and kind Megan, told me a story about kindness, about sacrifice, about a son I thought I knew completely, but who still had secrets. And that story changed everything. Helen looked directly at Megan. You gave me my son back. Not physically, of course, but you gave me an understanding of him that I never had. You showed me the impact he made. You gave me purpose when I had none. And you gave me a family when I was completely alone. Megan was openly crying now, as were many others in the room. So this birthday isn't about me, Helen continued. It's about what happens when pain meets purpose, when loss meets love, when strangers become family. It's about all the brave women who've come through here, all the children who've grown up in this supportive environment, all the volunteers who've given their time and resources. You are the real gift. You are the living legacy of my son. The party continued through the night with music, dancing, stories shared, and endless hugs. Gabriel, now a tall and articulate young man, moved around the room talking to everyone, absorbing the stories, understanding more deeply with each moment the weight and beauty of the legacy he carried. Late at night, when most guests had already left, only the immediate family remained. Helen, Megan, Gabriel, and surprisingly Ryan Taylor, who had become a constant and helpful presence in their lives. "You know," Ryan said hesitantly, "I spent a long time angry and jealous of a man I never knew. But now, seeing all this, I understand. He wasn't my rival or a threat. He was just a good man doing what good men do, and I should have celebrated that instead of resisting. What matters is that you got there eventually," Helen said kindly. "It's never too late to do better." Gabriel looked at his father, and there was something new in his eyes, not the unconditional love a small child has, but something perhaps more valuable, respect earned through consistent effort and genuine change. "Dad," Gabriel said, "I wanted to thank you for showing up today, for being present these past years. I know it hasn't been easy for you." Ryan felt his chest tighten with emotion. It was the first time Gabriel had called him Dad without hesitation or irony. "Thank you for giving me the chance, son," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I don't deserve it, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." That night, after everyone had left, Helen was alone in her room looking at the 3 letters from Richard that she kept in a special frame on the wall. She read them often, finding new meaning and comfort in the words each time. "Use the pain to create something beautiful, Mum." She had done that. With Megan's help, with all the brave women, with an entire community, she had transformed the deepest pain of her life into something extraordinary. She fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, something she wouldn't have thought possible a decade ago. The years continued their relentless march. Gabriel grew up and went to university, choosing to study social work, to no one's surprise. He said he wanted to formally understand what he had seen work intuitively throughout his life. Megan, now in her 40s, had become a respected figure in the field of social work and education. She was often invited to speak at conferences, write articles, consult on public policy, but she never let success pull her away from the work on the ground, from the real families who needed support. Helen, entering her mid-80s, had slowed down significantly. Her body was tired, but her mind remained sharp and her spirit unbreakable. She was no longer involved in the day-to-day of the program, but she was the spiritual presence that kept everything connected. On a Tuesday morning, Megan found Helen sitting in the garden, looking at the flowers they had planted together years ago. "Good morning," Megan said cheerfully. "Ready for our visit to the cemetery today?" Helen looked at Megan with a strange expression, half sad, half peaceful. "Megan, dear, sit here with me for a moment." Megan sat, immediately worried by the tone. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Helen assured. "Better than fine, actually, but I need to talk to you about some things. Practical things I can't put off any longer." "Mrs. Helen, let me finish," Helen asked gently. "I'm 84 years old. I've lived a long life and, despite the losses, a good life. Especially the last years with you and Gabriel. They were the best years of my life." "Don't talk like that," Megan protested, knowing where this was going. "Megan," Helen took the younger woman's hands, "I'm not going anywhere immediately, but I need to make sure everything is in order. The program, the house, everything. And I need you to know some things." Megan nodded, trying not to cry. "I've arranged everything legally. The program has its own foundation with enough funds to continue for decades. The house will be donated to the program to continue serving as one of the shelter homes, and there's a fund specifically set up for Gabriel's education to ensure he never has to worry about money while pursuing his studies." "You don't have to." "I want to," Helen insisted. "You two are the family I chose, the one fate gave me when I needed it most. Everything I have, everything I've built was because of you, with you. It's only fair that it continues to serve you and Gabriel." "Mrs. Wilson, I don't know what to say." Megan was crying now. "Don't say anything. Just promise me one thing." Helen waited for Megan to make eye contact. "Continue the work. Not just the program, but the greater mission. Keep turning pain into purpose, loss into love. Keep being the example you've been, and teach Gabriel to do the same." "I promise," Megan said through her tears. "But you'll still be here for a long time to see all this." Helen smiled, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, just accepting what was to come. They went to the cemetery that afternoon, as they always did on Tuesdays. They brought the colourful balloons, now such an established tradition that the balloon vendor near the cemetery always had a special selection set aside for them. At Richard's grave, Helen stood in silence longer than usual. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you, son, for everything, for your kindness, for your sacrifice, for giving me these two wonderful people to love. You accomplished more in your 28 years than many do in a lifetime. And I finally understand that I shouldn't blame myself for not knowing everything. You were protecting me the way you always did. And through that protection, you ended up giving me the greatest gift, a purpose, a mission, a family." Megan stood by Helen's side, holding her hand, the two united in gratitude and love. "You can rest now, my son," Helen continued. "Your work here is complete, and the legacy you left is in good hands. Megan will continue, Gabriel will continue, and the circle of kindness you started will keep expanding far beyond what any of us can imagine." They returned home in contemplative silence. That night, Helen fell asleep early, more tired than usual. Megan checked on her a few times before going to her own bed, each time finding her sleeping peacefully. In the morning, when Megan went to wake Helen with coffee, she found her still in bed, a small smile on her face. She had passed during the night, quietly, at peace. Megan sat on the edge of the bed, holding Helen's cold hand, crying silently. It wasn't the desperate sadness that Helen had felt when she lost Richard. It was a gentle sadness, mixed with gratitude for all the time they had, for all the lessons learned, for all the love shared. Gabriel, who had come to visit for the weekend, found Megan like that. He sat beside her, putting his arm around his mother's shoulders, the two crying together for the woman who had been grandmother, mentor, savior, and friend. Helen's funeral was huge. Hundreds of people attended, each with a story about how she had touched their lives. The women she had helped, the children she had sheltered, the volunteers she had inspired. Everyone was there to pay their last respects. Megan gave the eulogy, her voice breaking only once. Helen Wilson was a woman of contradictions. She was strong, but vulnerable. She was wealthy, but generous. She was reserved, but capable of deep love. She lost so much, her husband, her only son, and she could have let those losses destroy her. But instead, she chose to let them transform her. When I met Mrs. Wilson 13 years ago, I was at my most vulnerable. I had almost lost my baby, was trapped in a toxic marriage and had no support or resources. And this woman, who was dealing with her own immense pain, chose to help me. Not because she knew me, not because she owed me anything, but because it was who she chose to be. And through that choice, she didn't just change my life and Gabriel's life. She created a ripple of change that touched hundreds of families. Every woman who went through the Richard Wilson Foundation, every child who grew up in one of our homes, every volunteer who donated their time, we are all part of Helen's legacy. Megan paused, looking at the coffin. "Mrs. Helen, you once told me that Richard's legacy was far greater than anyone imagined. But you didn't realize that your legacy would be just as immense. You took your son's kindness and multiplied it 1,000-fold. You transformed a single act of heroism into a movement of community compassion. Rest in peace knowing your work continues, that the foundation you started is strong and growing, that the families you helped are thriving and helping others in turn, that the name Wilson will remain synonymous with kindness, compassion, and transformation." Helen was buried beside Richard, the two headstones now side by side, mother and son reunited. A new plaque was installed, complementing the previous one. Helen Wilson turned pain into purpose, created family where there was loneliness, proved that love multiplies endlessly. In the following months, Megan struggled with the weight of carrying on alone. There were moments when she wanted to give up, when the responsibility felt overwhelming. But then she would look at Gabriel, or see a mother arriving at the foundation with hope and fear in her eyes, and find the strength to continue. Gabriel had completed his undergraduate degree and was pursuing a master's in public policy. His thesis focused on community intervention programs, using the Richard Wilson Foundation as the primary case study. He had big plans to expand and systematize the model, making it replicable on a national scale. 1 year after Helen's passing, on what would have been her 85th birthday, Megan organized a celebration at the cemetery. It wasn't somber or morbid, but a true celebration of life. Hundreds of people attended, bringing stories, photos, and memories. A memory wall was set up where people could write messages to Helen and Richard. The messages ranged from simple thank yous to long, detailed stories of impact and transformation. Gabriel, now 20 years old, gave a speech that left many in tears. "I never met my Uncle Richard. He passed before I was born. But in a way, I know him better than many people know their own relatives, because I grew up hearing stories about him, about his kindness, his courage, his willingness to sacrifice for others. And I had the privilege of knowing my grandmother, Helen. Not by blood, but by choice. She adopted me into her heart when I was just a baby, and she taught me by example what it means to live a life of purpose." These two people, Richard and Helen Wilson, together changed the course of hundreds of lives, including mine, including my mother's, and every one of you here today. Gabriel looked around the crowd, making eye contact with as many as he could. But the work isn't finished. There are still mothers struggling, children needing support, families needing a second chance. And it's our responsibility, all of us who have been touched by this legacy, to continue the work. So today, on this birthday, I make a commitment. I will dedicate my life, just as Richard dedicated his, just as Grandma Helen dedicated her later years, to making a difference, to turning pain into purpose, loss into love, despair into hope. The crowd erupted in applause, and in that moment, something special happened. People began to stand up one by one, making their own commitments. Julia, the first woman to go through the program, committed to returning as a full-time mentor. Marcia offered her accounting skills to help other women start small businesses. Ryan Taylor announced a substantial donation to expand the program to 2 more cities. One by one, people who had been helped were now offering to help. It was the multiplication of the legacy in real time, living proof that kindness truly generates more kindness. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Megan watched everything with a mix of admiration and emotion. Helen would be so proud. Richard would be so proud. They had planted seeds, and now the forest was growing. The following years saw a dramatic expansion of the Richard Wilson Foundation. With Gabriel bringing academic knowledge and organizational skills, with Megan providing practical wisdom and emotional connection, and with a growing network of volunteers and donors, the program reached 15 cities in 5 different states. Each location maintained the fundamental principles that Helen and Megan had established. It wasn't just about providing temporary shelter, it was about providing holistic support, treating every woman and child as individuals with unique potential, creating community rather than charity. Gabriel married at 25 to Anna, Julia's daughter who had grown up in the program's homes. The two had reconnected in university and discovered a deep connection based on shared values and similar experiences. Megan couldn't be happier, seeing her son find a partner who truly understood the legacy he carried. At the wedding, held in the garden of the original house that Helen had transformed into the first shelter home, Megan made an emotional toast. To my son Gabriel, who proudly carries the name of a hero he never met, and to Anna, who grew up in our program and now returns not as someone needing help, but as someone offering help. You both represent everything the Richard Wilson Foundation always wanted to be, a cycle of support, growth, and transformation. and to those who aren't physically here, but whose presence we feel every day. Richard Henry Wilson, who started everything with a simple act of kindness, and Helen Wilson, who took that kindness and multiplied it 1,000 times. You live in every life we touch, every family we help, every child who grows up knowing they are loved and valued. The guests raised their glasses, many with tears in their eyes, honoring those who had begun a journey that now continued through generations. 2 years later, Megan and Gabriel were back at the cemetery for the monthly gathering, now expanded to a quarterly meeting due to the growing number of participants. It was the 20th meeting since Helen's passing, and something special was planned. Family, friends, all who have been touched by the Wilson legacy, Gabriel began. Today we mark not just our regular quarterly meeting, but something even more special. My mother and I have an announcement. Megan stepped forward holding a large envelope. 15 years ago, a woman full of anger confronted me in this cemetery. I was terrified, not knowing how she would react to the truth about her son. But that confrontation transformed into the beginning of something extraordinary. She opened the envelope and pulled out an official document. Today, we're announcing the creation of the Helen and Richard Wilson Foundation, a national organization dedicated to replicating our model of support for single mothers and families in transition throughout Brazil. We have commitments from partners in 20 states. We have secured funding for the next 10 years, and we have a team of dedicated professionals ready to make it happen. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Gabriel continued, but more important than the physical expansion is the spiritual expansion of what we do. We don't just want to create more shelters. We want to create a movement of people who choose to turn their pain into purpose, who choose to help instead of just watching, who choose to believe that one person can make a difference. Anna, now Gabriel's wife and program coordinator, joined them. And to symbolize this movement, we are launching Richard's Kindness Network. It's an app and online platform where anyone can share how they were helped and how they are helping others. We want to map the impact, show how one act of kindness multiplies across generations. In the following months, the Kindness Network grew exponentially. People from all over the country began sharing stories, not just related to the Richard Wilson Foundation, but all kinds of kindness. Someone who paid a stranger's bill at the supermarket. Someone who offered mentorship to a struggling young person. Someone who donated blood and saved a life. Each story was marked and connected, creating a visual web of kindness that spread across the entire country. And at the center of this web, the original story, Richard donating blood to Megan, Helen welcoming Megan and Gabriel, Megan founding the program, Gabriel expanding the vision. One story in particular went viral nationwide. An 18-year-old girl in Los Angeles shared that her mother had gone through the Richard Wilson Foundation 10 years ago. Now she had just graduated from medical school and had made her first blood donation. In the description she wrote, "10 years ago my mother and I had nothing. We were fleeing violence with nowhere to go, no hope. The Richard Wilson Foundation took us in, gave us time to recover, gave me the chance to keep studying. Today, I graduated as a doctor, the first in my family to go to university. And my first act as a doctor was to donate blood, honoring the man I never met, but who changed my life by saving another mother's life years before I was born. The legacy continues." Megan read that post with tears streaming down her face. She showed it to Gabriel, who was equally moved. "She understood," Gabriel said in awe. "Completely understood what we're trying to do." "Helen would see this and be so proud," Megan added. "And Richard, well, he'd probably be a bit embarrassed by all the attention, but proud too." 20 years after that first meeting at the cemetery, Megan was about to turn 50. Gabriel was 25, and Anna was pregnant with their first child. When they announced it was a boy and they planned to name him Richard Henry, Megan cried for a full hour. "The name continues," she said through tears. "The legacy continues." The night before the delivery, Megan was alone at home, looking at an old photo. It was from the first celebration at the cemetery, right after Helen had died. Her, Gabriel, and dozens of other people surrounding Helen and Richard's graves, all connected by gratitude and love. Her phone rang. It was Gabriel. "Mom, Anna is in labor. We're heading to the hospital. I'm on my way," Megan said immediately, grabbing her keys. At the hospital, Megan held Anna's hand throughout the process, offering words of encouragement, reminding her to breathe, being present in the way she herself would have wanted someone to be there for her during Gabriel's birth. When the baby was finally born, healthy and crying loudly, Gabriel held him with tears in his eyes. "Richard Henry," he said softly, "welcome to the world, little one. You have a very special name to honor, but don't worry. We'll help you understand what it means." Megan looked at her grandson, at this tiny being who carried such a meaningful name, and she felt something she hadn't felt completely in a long time. Wholeness. The circle had closed. Richard had saved Megan and Gabriel. Helen had welcomed and raised them both. Megan and Gabriel had continued the legacy, and now a new generation was here, ready to carry the torch forward. In the years that followed, little Richard grew up hearing the same stories that Gabriel had heard, about the great-uncle who saved a life by donating blood, about his great-grandmother Helen, who turned pain into purpose, about his grandmother Megan, who refused to give up, about his father Gabriel, who expanded the dream. And like Gabriel before him, little Richard absorbed these stories, internalized these values. At 5 years old, when a classmate didn't have a snack, he shared his. When asked why, he simply replied, "Because that's what family does. We help." Megan, now in her early 50s, had slowed down a bit. She was no longer running from meeting to meeting, but had taken on a more advisory role. She occasionally gave lectures, wrote articles, mentored young professionals entering the field of social work. But what she loved most was time with family, with Gabriel, Anna, and little Richard. Sunday dinners at the house that once belonged to Helen, where Megan now lived as the resident administrator of the program, walks in the park with her grandson, bedtime stories about real heroes instead of fictional ones. One day, little Richard, now 7 years old, asked a question during one of these bedtime stories. "Grandma, do you think Uncle Richard and Grandma Helen can see us from heaven?" Megan thought carefully about how to answer. "I don't know if there's a heaven, my love," she said honestly, "but I know they live, not in bodies, but in actions. Every time someone chooses to be kind, every time someone helps a stranger, every time someone donates blood or offers shelter or simply listens with compassion, they are alive in that action." "So they're alive in me?" Richard asked. "Yes," Megan smiled. "Very much alive, because you carry their name and their values, and when you grow up and have your own children, you'll pass these values on, and so they keep living, generation after generation." "So death isn't really the end?" The question was profound for such a young child. "No," Megan said with conviction. "Not for people who live with purpose and love. For those people, death is just a transition. The body stops, but the impact, the legacy, the love, all of that continues, and it keeps growing, multiplying, touching more and more lives." Richard thought about this for a moment, then nodded contentedly and snuggled under the covers. "Good night, Grandma. I love you." "I love you too, my little warrior." Megan kissed his forehead. Leaving the room, Megan found Gabriel waiting in the hallway. "He asked that question, didn't he?" Gabriel smiled. "About whether they can see us." "How did you know?" "Because I asked you the same question when I was his age." Gabriel laughed. "And you gave pretty much the same answer." Mother and son walked down the stairs together, heading to the kitchen where Anna was making tea. "You know," Gabriel said as they sat down, "sometimes I have trouble believing everything that happened. How a single choice, a single act of kindness created all this." "It wasn't a single choice," Megan corrected. "It was a series of choices. Richard chose to donate blood. I chose to accept. Helen chose to forgive me and welcome me. We chose to create the program. You chose to continue the legacy. It's thousands of small choices, all building upon the previous ones." "Mom is right," Anna added. "Legacy isn't about one heroic moment. It's about consistency, about choosing kindness repeatedly, even when it's difficult, even when there's no recognition." They talked late into the night, as they often did. sharing stories, making plans, just enjoying each other's company. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine 25 years ago, when Megan was desperate and alone in a hospital. On the 30th anniversary of the Richard Wilson Foundation, a massive celebration was organized. The event lasted 3 days, with panel discussions, workshops, celebrations, and, of course, the gathering at the cemetery. Over 1,000 people attended throughout the 3 days, women who had gone through the program decades ago and were now successful professionals, entrepreneurs, educators, children who had grown up in the foster homes and were now adults making their own difference in the world, volunteers who had donated countless hours, donors who had provided resources, all united by a common mission. Megan, now in her 60s, gave the opening speech. 30 years ago, I was a terrified young woman in a hospital, thinking I would lose my baby and possibly my own life. A stranger offered help, and I accepted out of desperation. That acceptance changed the course of my life and hundreds of other lives. 25 years ago, I confronted a furious woman in a cemetery. She yelled at me, accused me of terrible things. But when I finally managed to explain, that anger turned into understanding, that understanding into connection, and that connection into family. And today, 3 decades after that first act of kindness, we are here. Over 300 families directly helped, thousands of lives touched indirectly, a national movement of compassion and support, all because a 28-year-old man chose to donate blood to a foreigner. Megan paused, emotion thickening her voice. Richard Henry Wilson will never fully know the impact he had. Helen Wilson never saw the full scale of what we started together. But I know. Gabriel knows. All of you here know. And our responsibility is to make sure that this knowledge, this gratitude, this mission keeps spreading. The crowd applauded for minutes on end. Gabriel joined Megan on stage, bringing little Richard with him. "This is my son, Richard Henry Wilson III," Gabriel announced. "He's 7 years old and already understands he has a legacy to honor. But we don't want it to be a burden. We want it to be an inspiration. Just as it was for me, just as it was for my mother." Little Richard, who had been prepared for this moment, took the microphone with his father's help. "My name is Richard, same as the great-uncle I never met," he said in a clear voice. "And when I grow up, I'm going to help people like he did, because that's what families do. We take care of each other." There wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. The simplicity and sincerity of a child's words perfectly captured the spirit of everything they had built. That night, at the cemetery under the stars, hundreds of people gathered around the graves of Helen and Richard. Colorful balloons filled the sky. Candles illuminated the space, and stories were shared, each one adding another layer to the tapestry of impact they had woven together. Megan stood between the 2 graves, Gabriel on one side, little Richard on the other, Anna next to Gabriel. 4 generations connected by love, loss, and legacy. "Thank you," Megan whispered to the headstones, "for starting something so beautiful, for showing me that loss doesn't have to be the end, for giving me a family when I needed it most, for teaching me that kindness truly matters, that one person can make a difference, that love multiplies indefinitely. I promise," Gabriel added his own message, "to keep honoring what you started. Never let the legacy die. Teach my son and his children about the power of choosing kindness." "I will be good," little Richard said simply, "like you were." The 4 people stood there for a long moment, silent in contemplation and gratitude. Around them, the crowd began to softly sing a song that Anna had composed specifically for this occasion, a melody about love that transcends death, about legacies that multiply, about the family we choose rather than the one we're born into. As the last notes of the song floated in the night air, Megan felt something. It wasn't a physical presence. It wasn't anything that could be explained rationally, but it was a feeling of completeness, of approval, of love that continues even when the body is no longer there. She looked at Gabriel and saw the tears in his eyes. She looked at Anna and saw reverence in her expression. She looked at little Richard and saw understanding beyond his years. "It's time for us to go," Megan finally said softly. "But we'll be back. We always come back." "Always," Gabriel agreed. The years continued. Little Richard grew up, becoming an articulate and compassionate teenager. He chose to pursue medicine, specifically hematology, inspired by the story of how donated blood saved his grandmother and allowed him to be born. Gabriel and Anna had 2 more children, a girl named Helen and a boy named Charles, honoring both sides of the Wilson family. The house that had once been Helen's was always full of life, children's laughter echoing through the halls that had been silent for so long. Megan, entering her 70s, had finally truly slowed down. She had passed the leadership of the Richard Wilson Foundation completely to Gabriel and Anna, trusting it was in excellent hands. She spent her days writing memoirs, doing occasional volunteer work, and mostly being a grandmother. On a quiet afternoon, Megan was in the garden when she received an unexpected call. It was from St. Luke's Hospital, the same hospital where everything had begun decades ago. "Mrs. Taylor?" The voice on the phone was young and excited. "My name is Dr. Richard Wilson. Yes, it's your grandson. I'm calling to share amazing news." Megan sat down, her heart racing. Little Richard had graduated from medical school 2 years ago and was doing his residency in hematology. "What happened, dear?" "Today I made my first successful blood donation that saved a life." His voice was filled with emotion. "A pregnant woman with severe anemia. AB negative blood, just like mine. Just like the great uncle I'm named after. We performed the transfusion, and she and the baby will be fine." Megan couldn't hold back her tears. "Mother and baby will be fine," she repeated, the phrase echoing through the decades. "Just like you and me." "Exactly," Richard said, and she could hear that he was crying too. "The circle continues, Grandma, the legacy continues." After hanging up, Megan sat in the garden for a long time, processing the beautiful, perfect symmetry of the moment. Great-uncle Richard had donated blood to save a mother and baby. Now grandson Richard had done exactly the same thing. Not because he had to, but because he chose to, because he was raised understanding that some things are worth personal sacrifice. That evening at the family dinner, Richard told the full story, how he had been on duty when a pregnant patient arrived in critical condition, how he had checked her blood type and realized it was compatible, how he had offered to donate without hesitation. "You know what was most incredible?" Richard said. "When I said my full name, Richard Henry Wilson, the nurse helping me widened her eyes. She had heard about the program, about the original story, and she said it was beautiful to see the legacy continue in this way. 'You made your great-great-uncle proud,' Megan said with emotion, 'and great-grandmother Helen, and the whole family.' "I hope so," Richard replied humbly. "I just tried to do what was right, what you all taught me to do." It was at that moment that Megan truly realized more deeply than ever before that the work was complete. Not in the sense that there was nothing more to do, there would always be more families to help, more lives to touch, but in the sense that the legacy was firmly established, passing naturally from generation to generation without needing to be forced or manipulated. The values that the original Richard Henry Wilson had lived, that Helen had multiplied, that Megan and Gabriel had systematized, were now so ingrained in the family that they didn't even need to be explicitly taught. They were simply part of who they were. A few weeks later, Megan organized a special gathering at the cemetery. It wasn't one of the regular quarterly meetings. It was something more intimate, just the immediate family. Megan, Gabriel, Anna, the 3 grandchildren, and surprisingly Ryan Taylor, Megan's ex-husband who had become a respected part of the extended family. "Why are we here, Grandma?" Little Helen, now 10 years old, asked. "Because it's time to pass something forward," Megan replied. She took 3 envelopes from her bag. Each contained one of the original letters that great-great-uncle Richard had written before his blood donations. These letters were written over 30 years ago by a young man who knew he was risking his life to do what he believed was right. They were left to your great-grandmother Helen, who kept them for years before showing them to me. And now, it's time to pass them to the next generation. Megan handed the envelopes to her 3 grandchildren. Richard, 19, received the first letter. Helen, 10, received the second. Charles, 8, received the third. "These letters are your inheritance," Megan explained. "Not an inheritance of money or property, though that exists too, but an inheritance of values, of mission, of purpose. I want you to read these letters, understand their weight, and let them guide you as you grow and make your own choices in life." The three grandchildren opened their respective envelopes with reverence, silently reading the words written so long ago. When they finished, all three were crying. "He knew," Richard whispered. "He knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. And he asked us to create something beautiful from the pain," Helen added, pointing to a line in her letter. "And we did. We did everything he asked. So we have to keep going." Charles, the youngest, said with conviction, "We can't let the legacy stop with us." Megan smiled through her tears, her heart so full of pride she felt it might burst. "That's exactly the point," she said. "The legacy isn't about the past. It's about the future. About each of you taking what you've learned and creating your own paths to make a difference." Gabriel joined Megan, putting his arm around his mother's shoulders. "Mom, have you ever thought about writing all this down?" he asked. "The full story, from that first day at the hospital until now? It would be an incredible record, something future generations could learn from." Megan considered the idea. She had written 2 books, but both focused on specific aspects of the story. Perhaps it was time to write the full account, the true story of how pain turned into purpose through decades and generations. "Maybe," she finally replied, "but only if you help me. This isn't just my story. It's our story, all of ours." And so, in the following months, the Wilson family gathered weekly to work on the book. Megan provided the memories and perspective. Gabriel added the context of the foundation's growth. Anna contributed professional insights about what made the model work. The grandchildren added their perspectives about growing up with such a legacy. The result was a comprehensive and deeply personal account of 35 years of transformation. From the moment Richard first offered to donate blood to the present, where his namesake grandson had made the same choice. From Helen's initial anger to her transformation into the loving matriarch of an extended family. From Megan's struggles to her emergence as a leader and visionary. The book was published on the 35th anniversary of the Richard Wilson Foundation and instantly became a national bestseller. But more important than sales were the messages that began arriving. People across the country sharing how the story had inspired them to make a difference in their own communities. A man in Washington, D.C., started a similar program for single parents. A woman in Miami created a support network for grandparents raising grandchildren. A group in San Diego established a community blood bank specifically focused on rare types. The legacy was multiplying in ways no one could have predicted. It was no longer just about the Richard Wilson Foundation. It was about a larger movement of people choosing kindness, choosing to help, choosing to make a difference. 5 years after the book's publication, Megan was 75. Her body was slowing down, but her mind remained sharp. She had moved to a smaller house attached to the foundation's original property, allowing Gabriel and Anna to take over the main house with their grown children. One Tuesday morning, 40 years after that first meeting at the cemetery, Megan woke with a strange feeling, not exactly pain, but a sense of completeness, of a cycle closing. She dressed carefully, putting on her favorite outfit. She called Gabriel. "My son, could you take me to the cemetery today? I know it's not our usual day, but I feel I need to go." "Of course, Mom, I'll be there in 20 minutes. In the car, Gabriel noticed something different about Megan, a deep peace that transcended normal happiness. "Mom, are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," Megan answered honestly. "I'm complete. I've lived a life that began in despair, but turned into something beautiful. I had an extraordinary son, wonderful grandchildren. I was part of something much bigger than myself. What more could anyone ask for?" Gabriel felt a tightness in his chest, but said nothing. He just took his mother's hand and held it all the way. At the cemetery, Megan went straight to Helen and Richard's graves. Gabriel stayed a few steps back, giving her privacy. "Hello, old friends," Megan said softly, touching both headstones. "It's been a long journey since that first day, hasn't it? Richard, you saved my life and Gabriel's life. Helen, you gave us a family and a purpose. And together you taught me that love doesn't really end, it just transforms." She sat on the nearby bench, the same bench where she had sat 40 years earlier when Helen first heard her story. "I think my work here is complete," Megan continued. "Gabriel and Anna are managing the foundation magnificently. The grandchildren understand the legacy and are creating their own ways to make a difference. The mission is safe, growing, multiplying. And I'm tired," she admitted with a small smile, "not in a bad way, but tired the way one gets after a day well lived, complete, ready to rest." Gabriel approached, sitting beside his mother. "Mum, you're scaring me a little." "There's no need to be afraid, my son." Megan took his hand. "Death is just part of life, and I've had an extraordinary life, a life I never would have imagined possible on that terrifying day at the hospital. But it's not time yet," Gabriel insisted. "You still have so much to live for, so much to see." "Perhaps," Megan agreed. "But if it's my time tomorrow or 10 years from now, it doesn't matter. Because what's important, the legacy, the love, all of that is already established. It continues through you, through the children, through every life we've touched." Mother and son sat in silence for a long time, just absorbing the peace of that place which had seen so much pain, but also so much healing. "Promise me one thing," Megan finally said. "Anything. When my time comes, and eventually it will, I want to be buried here, between Helen and Richard, not as an intruder but as part of the family we chose to be. And I want you to continue the gatherings, continue celebrating life instead of mourning death. I want laughter and colorful balloons and stories about how kindness multiplies." "I promise," Gabriel said, his voice thick with emotion, "but that won't be for a long, long time." Megan smiled but didn't answer. She just squeezed her son's hand and looked at the blue sky above, feeling gratitude for every moment, every choice, every person who had been part of her extraordinary journey. 2 years later, at 77 years old, Megan Taylor passed away peacefully in her sleep, just as Helen had done. She was buried exactly where she asked, between Helen and Richard Wilson, 3 people united not by blood, but by choice, by love, by legacy. Her funeral was immense, with thousands attending to pay their last respects. Gabriel gave the eulogy, his voice breaking only once. "My mother always said that family isn't defined by blood, but by choice. And she proved that every day of her life. She chose to accept help when she needed it most. She chose to forgive and be forgiven. She chose to turn her gratitude into action. She chose to create an extended family of hundreds of people, all connected by love and common mission." Young Ryan, now an established doctor, also spoke. "My grandmother taught me that legacy isn't about what we leave behind when we go, but about how we live while we're here. She lived with purpose, with passion, with unwavering love. And through her life, she touched countless other lives. This is the kind of immortality that truly matters." After the funeral, there was a celebration of Megan's life exactly as she had requested. Colorful balloons, laughter, stories about kindness and transformation. It wasn't sad, although there were tears. It was a genuine celebration of an extraordinarily well-lived life, and when Gabriel installed Megan's headstone, he chose words that perfectly captured who she was. Megan Taylor, saved by kindness, multiplied it 1,000 times, proved chosen, love is as strong as born love. Mother, grandmother, friend, savior of hundreds, the legacy continues. The following years saw the Richard Wilson Foundation continue growing. Gabriel and Anna managed it with the same passion and dedication that Megan and Helen had before them. Young Ryan eventually left clinical medicine to join the foundation full-time, bringing medical expertise and unique perspective. Helen, the granddaughter who carried her great-grandmother's name, became a lawyer specializing in family law, offering pro bono services to women going through the program. Charles went into business, but with a focus on social entrepreneurship, helping women from the program start their own businesses. Each generation found their own way to contribute, to honor the legacy while creating their own paths. 50 years after that first meeting at the cemetery, the Richard Wilson Foundation had become a respected national institution. It had directly helped over 2,000 families and indirectly touched tens of thousands of lives. But more important than the numbers were the stories. Women who had gone through the program and were now doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs, artists. Children who had grown up in foster homes and were now raising their own families, passing on the values of compassion and community. At the 50th anniversary meeting, Gabriel, now 60 years old and starting to show his age, gave a final speech. 50 years ago, my mother was in a hospital, desperate and scared. A young man she barely knew offered to save her life, and she accepted. That moment, that choice, created a ripple effect that is still growing half a century later. All the people who were helped, all the children who grew up in safe and loving environments, all the volunteers who donated time and resources, all of you are part of that ripple effect. You are living proof that kindness matters, that one person can make a difference, that love multiplies indefinitely. Richard Henry Wilson died at 28. Many would say it was a short life, a tragedy. But when you look at the impact he had, the lives he saved and the countless lives that were touched as a direct result of his actions, you could argue that he lived more fully in 28 years than many do in 80. Helen Wilson lost her husband and son, suffered unimaginable pain. But she transformed that pain into purpose, created family where there was loneliness, proved that it's never too late to start over. And Megan Taylor, my mother, started with fear and despair, but ended with strength and grace. She took the gift she received and multiplied it 1,000 times. Gabriel paused, looking around at the crowd of faces, young and old, all connected by this shared story. The legacy continues, through each one of you, through the choices you make every day, through the kindness you spread in the world. And as long as we keep choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, compassion over indifference, Richard, Helen, and Megan will never truly die. They live in every act of kindness, in every transformed life, in every touched heart. So let's continue, not out of obligation but by choice. The same choice that Richard made, that Helen made, that Megan made, the choice to make a difference, to matter, to live with purpose. The crowd stood up, applauding for minutes. It was more than applause for Gabriel. It was a collective affirmation of the commitment to continue the work, to honor the legacy, to spread kindness. End of story. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Do you believe that a single act of kindness can create such a powerful ripple effect? Have you ever been in a situation where someone helped you significantly, or you helped someone in need? Share your experiences in the comments. I love reading real stories of kindness and generosity. And if this story touched your heart in any way, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one. Thank you so much for your company.